Welcome back to another very special episode of the Aether Hour. I'm your host, Dmitry Kalyagin, joined today by a new guest, actually, for a show specifically dedicated to Russian economics. In particular, me and my new guest here, Gennady, will be speaking about BRICS as well as Russia's energy resources, in particular gas, oil, coal, uranium, and the Russian nuclear industry. So going into detail on these very wonderful and intriguing subjects about which there are many mythologies that have formed, unfortunately, in our world. Now, a little bit about Gennady. He is a person who I've been an acquaintance of for many, many years, many decades at this point. He's an Orthodox Christian Russian who has been studying economics and working in economics, in particular with finance and studying the Russian Donbass conflict and essentially world economics very much in depth since at least 2013 and 14, at least the beginning of the Maidan crisis. So his knowledge on the subject of economics dwarfs mine, and his input into some of these very interesting subjects such as BRICS, this sort of new union of nations, this network, will be very interesting and I think even enlightening for a layperson such as myself, And of course, this particular episode of Aether Hour will go very well in conjunction with all our future World War Now episodes, and it'll be a good reference point and a good beginning opening episode to some of our explorations of the complexities of the world economy and how macroeconomics works. In the future, we have some very interesting episodes planned with Gennady where we will get into some interesting subject matter such as Russian manufacturing industry, how exactly Russia is trying to bypass the current sanctions which have been installed since the SMO, and a very complex matter such as Russia's demographics and what has taken place in Russia over the last 100 years and since the dissolution of the USSR, subject matter which frankly no one else is touching upon in an unfiltered, uncensored, and frankly, we're trying to be objective here on our episodes, despite the fact that we have a very Christian worldview and perspective, but we do try to look at the facts here as they are, kind of a priori, removing any sort of biases, but still remaining Christians in how we assess these very complex and difficult, sensitive matters. So, Gennady, thank you for joining me and all of our great listeners here today on this Aether Hour episode for a discussion of BRICS, Russia's energy sector, and the nuclear industry. So maybe give us a few words about BRICS. I guess we can just jump straight into it and exactly what BRICS is, because as I mentioned, mythology is deeply engulfing BRICS in terms of exactly what it is, the nature of it. Is it a new NATO? Is it a new European Union? People are just not clear. Is it a new G7? That nobody is sure what to compare it with. And frankly, the news and the mainstream media is adding to this confusion by essentially mislabeling BRICS. And it's just very difficult to actually have a clear image exactly of what this massive network of very different, varied nations is in the world today. Is it an alternative to the globalist unipolar system that's being built? So perhaps we can begin speaking about this matter and kind of dissolving some of the mythologies around it and just defining it in very simple terms.
Thank you very much, Dmitry. Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, pleasure to speak to all of the listeners. I myself have been a day one listener, day one fan. And in preparation for this podcast, I actually went back and listened to some of the older ones, in particular, your episode with Jay Dyer. I think it's a year and a half ago now in March or February 2023. Absolutely awesome episode where you open up with a topic about a potential Iranian conflict, Israeli-Iranian conflict. So you guys have always been on the mark, on the pulse with your predictions and your discussion topics. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Hoping we can have a good faith and honest discussion. I think we've been able to collate some interesting material and really summarize things quite simply and honestly for our viewers. I'm very excited to be here today. On the topics of BRICS, of course, the acronym, as we all know, stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Broadly, its founding members, apart from South Africa, which joined very shortly after a year and a half after the organization was founded. The organization was established in 2009, and it's an intergovernmental political and economic forum, very important word, forum, which coordinates multilateral policies as well as bilateral policies, with the general interactions being based on non-interference, equality, and mutual benefit. So since being established in 2009, it can broadly be thought about as having three periods. That's sort of what I've come to on my analysis of this organization. So From 2009 to 2014, we really see it being established and some of its founding aspects solidifying. Afterwards, we had a period of dormancy and consolidation from 2015 and 2022. And then from 2022 onwards, we've really seen the organization come to the forefront of the global political and economic scene, really reshape itself and really expand, quite frankly. So we'll cover these three periods in detail today. The first period with the founding in 2009, it really was existed on a backdrop of the global financial crisis, which of course ravaged starting the West and the United States and really moved on to hurt the entire world economically. So despite that, we saw China's economic growth. So this was really the first time where there was cracks in the Western economic alliance, when the Western economic sort of side or the way that the Western economies were interpreted by third world or East or South, global Southern countries. We really saw for the first time cracks appear in this sort of perception. And meanwhile, China was able to continue to grow, continue to develop, continue to urbanize, increase its life expectancy, increase its manufacturing base, its export capacity, its economic dominance across the globe. So this was the backdrop for which the BRICS was formed, as well as the institutions at the time, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, really having a very large overrepresentation of Western nations, with, for example, in the International Monetary Fund, the West having more than 50% of the world votes, as well as the World Bank. So BRICS was really the first time where the nations of the global South, the nations of the global East, these sort of even formulations weren't even quite as fleshed out back then. This was the first time that they were coming together exclusively without participation from these Western countries and able to just discuss things. And we'll see how that came to fruition and what that sort of developed into over the next decade and a half until today.
Interesting. So during this establishment period, we see the entire world, of course, first dips into the global financial crisis. If you recall, the Wall Street crash. Many countries, of course, suffered from this. Russian economic growth, we know, stagnated, essentially. Gone were the days of the 7 to 8, maybe even as high as 9% GDP annual growth, which the Russian economy experienced during the early years of Vladimir Putin's presidency from about the year 2000 until around 2008, essentially, when that kind of stopped. And so BRICS essentially is almost like the world economy, or at least the countries which were second to the United States, uniting into this multipolar forum, as you said, this massive network wherein they can gather and discuss very interesting and complex economic solutions, perhaps to various mutual issues that they have, right? It's not really an alliance or not a military alliance in this particular sense, nor is it necessarily anti-American, because all these various countries, India, China, for example, they do still trade very heavily with the United States. I think the only country really that has seemingly broken its relationship with the US, with the global hegemon at the moment, is of course the Russian Federation, as well the BRICS nations. But BRICS provides an alternative network wherein all these various countries can perhaps gather and discuss these complex issues without being dependent on America, right? America is it's not like the Security Council in the United Nations. I think that's an interesting comparison, right? Interestingly enough, of course, India is not a member of the Security Council, whilst France and the United Kingdom are. So that's, of course, a relic of the post-World War II world order, as you can see there. But you mentioned the IMF and the BRICS version of the IMF, which is essentially, well, we can't really compare the two too closely, but they do play a very similar role. Essentially, it's an international monetary fund of sorts, the new development bank of BRICS, which can then loan out currency to BRICS member states. Is that correct? And essentially bail them out when required, or even essentially provide loans which are not contingent on, again, this first world United States globalist model, right? Essentially, it's a multipolar alternative to the IMF. And we know the dangers and of course, the negativity that the IMF has brought upon some European countries. We've seen RT and Max Kaiser discuss these sort of things for decades now, at least. The Western hegemony is very much based on some of these European first world loans to various struggling European countries and other nations around the world. So very interesting period between 2009 and 2014, which you mentioned, the establishment of BRICS, the sort of real bolstering and growth of China again in this particular scene. Perhaps you can touch upon as well the contingency reserve arrangement, exactly what the contingency reserve arrangement is, given that it's never actually been used. So BRICS essentially, all the countries contribute to this particular reserve of currency, but this currency is only used in emergency circumstances. And thus far, since 2009, there hasn't been a circumstance wherein this reserve would needed to be tapped into by any BRICS member state, which really makes me
So,
think.
bro, yes, you're completely correct, Dimitri, and it's very important to have this set out correctly in our minds. The difference between the IMF, the difference between World Bank, and as you brought up, these two BRICS institutions, the New Development Bank and the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, sort of the alternatives that were put forward by these BRICS nations. First and foremost, BRICS itself has no executive function. The BRICS has no leader as such. It has no strict formations. Every year it cycles through a chairperson, which sets the agenda. A country and the chairperson in particular sets the agenda for the year and organizes various ministerial meetings, various industry meetings, and things of that nature. But during the period of formation, BRICS did put forward two sub-organizations that very much did have an executive branch and did have intended purposes. The New Development Bank, which was created as a sort of alternative to the World Bank, and the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, which was created as an alternative for the International Monetary Fund. And you're exactly correct in pointing out that these historic institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, were very much used to further the West's stranglehold on the world, to really force countries, when they were at their weakest, to take upon themselves certain economic, macroeconomic, fiscal, monetary policies which in the long term would put themselves would put themselves in a position to be taken advantage of by Western nations. Now, one great book for any of our listeners who are keen readers is the book titled Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. So this is a great book published in 2004 and really goes into detail about some of these multinational institutions, such as the IMF and the World Bank. So in the first period of the BRICS founding, from 2009 to 2014, the New Development Bank and the Contingency Reserve Arrangement were just being formed. From 2015 onwards, we really see the New Development Bank and Contingency Reserve Arrangement come into effect. Now, it's important for us to be realistic in our assessment of these institutions. Hence, why I've called the second period, from 2015 to 2022, a period of dormancy. Or, if you're more positive, consolidation of the BRICS and these two institutions. So starting with a more positive note, the New Development Bank received $100 billion worth of funding from the five founding members. And the intention there was that it was going to invest in mutually beneficial projects across the Eurasian continent and further, in the case of Brazil, that would be able to increase trade, increase logistics, increase the well-being, and really avoid the Western institutions and really establish a sort of alternative funding source that had never really existed to this extent. $100 billion is a very large amount of money, especially a decade ago. However, realistically, we see that only $32 billion of these loans were approved by the bank, and even less were physically given out, with physical construction starting up in various places. So we see that realistically that this has been underutilized. The most positive, optimistic estimate being that $32 billion worth of loans had actually eventuated in the decade then. And this institution actually ended cooperation with Russia in March 2022, right as the SMO started. So this institution formally stated and subsequently pulled out from any future projects. But to my understanding, all current projects were completed. However, no new projects were to be started in Russia from March 2022. So we can see that international pressure, the West has overwhelming monopolistic market share when it comes to financial transactions, financial funding sources across the globe. The New Development Bank was not willing to go against that and had cut ties with Russia, which is obviously unfortunate from our perspective. Moving on, and we have the Contingency Reserve Arrangement. So this was an alternative to the IMF and the International Monetary Fund. And the idea for at a time of a balance of payments crisis, which simply means that a country does not have enough foreign currency to purchase goods or services. So we can imagine a country that's gone through some sort of possibly sanctions regime comes to mind in our day and age, but historically maybe some sort of crises, environmental catastrophe, or various other political or economic collapse. A country may not have enough may not export enough goods to have foreign currency to import things like oil, to import things like agricultural products, to import things like cars and vehicles and various other things to keep its economy going, even to on a day-to-day basis. And there we can see really large fluctuations in its own exchange rate. And we can see, and historically, countries can lose, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% of their currency's valuation in a short amount of time. However, economic practice has shown us that if you can quickly jump in and stabilize it at a period of time, overcome this short-term shock, you can actually basically keep functioning with your higher levels of currency and not experience this currency depreciation if you're able to come in and mitigate the shock in the short term. That's where the IMF has historically really done great work from their perspective and has been able to come in at these most dangerous and volatile times and provide much needed funding, but with certain political strings attached, with certain policy strings attached. And the contingency reserve arrangement of the BRICS nations was created as an alternative for that, where these countries would say, hey, we each have 100 billion, 200 billion, 500 billion, 50 billion of foreign currency reserves in our central banks. If one of us were to experience a volatility event, we would actually pull together these funds and use them to stabilize that currency in the short term and that country's economy in the short term to overcome this crisis at minimal cost for that particular country. It all sounds very good. It all sounds very positive. It took many years to set up all of the backroom agreements, all of the swap lines were established between the central banks, all of the policies were put into place, the people were appointed into the director positions of this new institution, and it has never been used. So it has not been used in the history of its establishment, and at this point, it's to some extent defunct. It's not really in active use anymore, the contingency reserve arrangement. And the main reason for that is the central banks were not very keen. They were politically forced to, but in reality, practically, they were not very keen to give up their sovereignty over their own foreign currency reserves. So you can imagine that the South African central bank, with its limited capacity, as with all countries who are not emitters of their own currencies, which do not have much debt denominated in their own currencies, they really hold on dearly to their foreign currency reserves. They can't just simply print away. A country like South Africa can't print away and create new currency and then purchase foreign currency reserves. So they're really limited in whatever foreign currency they can obtain. And realistically, this was not able to be overcome. And even in the Russian crises of 2022, of the Russo-Ukrainian war, the special military operation, this contingency reserve arrangement did not come into effect. But however, we can see that Russia has broadly been able to stabilize its currency, which is a whole other question. However, these were the sort of two alternatives. The New Development Bank and the contingency reserve arrangement were the two alternatives structures that were put into place. And we can assess that they've had limited effect, limited in the New Development Bank and less so in the contingency reserve agreement. Okay. However, regardless of the fact, I would like to underline that it is important that the bureaucratic elements and bureaucratic progress was able to be made. Certain objections were able to be overcome, and these countries are working closer than what they were previously as a result. If we were to look back 2 decades ago, BRICS and all of this is a very new institution. 2 decades ago, it did not exist. There was no talks about this. There was no assessment about past events. There was no history of collaboration between these nations. So regardless, this is significant progress that has happened in a very short amount of time from the grand political lens, only 15 years. And we can see that this new framework of BRICS nations are coming together on a more, it's still forming, to be honest, the relationship between BRICS. It's still finding where its place in the world, the geopolitical and the international relations theme is. And we can see certain ventures are not fruitful, certain ventures are very fruitful, which we'll move on to shortly. However, it's definitely not in a stage of equilibrium. And these countries are for the first time really creating a platform of direct discussion between themselves that does not involve the West, which is very, very important because prior to 2009, the best that these countries could hope for was bilateral one-to-one relationships with themselves and their neighbors, or to be invited to a multilateral institution, something like the G20 or something along those lines. Where being invited was already a sign of success. Whereas here, for the first time, we can see that their own platform is being created. And not every venture is immediately successful, but the relationships are developing and it's building upon a solid foundation, or it is building a solid foundation upon which the next steps will be taken over the coming decades.
You know, what's really interesting, Gennady, is when BRICS was first formed and during its first summit in 2009, the actual member countries came together in the Russian Federation, but in Yekaterinburg of all cities, right? Which the city has definitely a lot of significance if you've been following Aether Hour and World War Now. It is one of the major places of Russian Orthodox pilgrimage. So it's coincidentally, that was the heartland zone in the southern Ural Mountains, wherein all these major Eurasian countries, plus South Africa and Brazil, of course, came together to sort of organize and to officially cut the red ribbon and consolidate this really important economic networking alliance, which I think is what we can kind of call it, this massive forum, which now, of course, has introduced 4 additional member states, right? At the beginning of 2024, the year has opened on the 1st of January with Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. So an interesting mixture of course, one Christian country, 2 Sunni countries, and a Shia country joining into the BRICS conglomeration. So now BRICS finally has some Muslim member states. And now, again, as 2024 moved along, and now we're almost at the end of the year, it really has come to a close fairly quickly. There's been so much news that we've covered. We see that Saudi Arabia is also very, very close to joining BRICS, or at least it's at least cooperating with BRICS incredibly closely since the beginning of 2024. So that's, I think, it'll play a major role in the future, I think, of not just the world economy, but also in the oil industry, which we will discuss towards the end of today's episode. But very interesting prospects for 2024. Russia, of course, is the chairship country of this year. And so, of course, the BRICS summit, the annual summit, will be taking place in Kazan, of all places, Tatarstan. Very interesting place in more or less central Russia, you can say, well, fairly western still, but near the Caspian Sea. In Kazan, in particular, what's interesting is that this is most likely the first annual summit of any major significance that will be taking place in Russia, in a country which is massively sanctioned by the Western countries, the globalists, which we discuss quite heavily on our different podcasts. But it really shows the consolidation of the international community, the real multipolar international community, not the one which is dominated by Western globalist interests and the Zionist military industrial complex run by the Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon. This particular real community is coming together in Russia in order to discuss things which may, again, impact their own citizens. It's a real show of national sovereignty of all these various nation states, showing that they oppose the current sanctions regime which is placed upon the Russian Federation quite unfairly, frankly, because we see what Israel is doing today in the Middle East, and not a single Western sanction has been placed upon it, despite the fact that casualties of innocence are absolutely through the roof and almost unbearable to even read about. It's that horrible. But we know the double standards and the hypocrisy which all of this goes into. But 2024, Gennady, has been a huge year for BRICS in general, for new member countries, bringing the number of membership countries to 9. We also have Saudi Arabia essentially waiting in the wings. We can almost say that there are 10 membership countries. And just in general, 2024, the prospects, we're almost at the end of the year, but it's been an incredibly successful year given the fact that it is the second year of the SMO. And we still see in the international community, the multipolar world, not turning its back on Russia. There are certain constraints, naturally, as they do develop when there are these thousands of sanctions placed upon a country and the entire world is somewhat, for the first time in decades, looking at the potential prospect of a nuclear conflict and the emergence of a hot third world war. And in various places around the world, there really are these sparks of very intense flaming conflict, like we see in the Middle East, Northwest Africa, and we finally see a lot of tension occur between Taiwan and China, which many people have been placing prognosis upon for a long time now, and the Philippines as well. But setting that aside, 2024 for BRICS, how was it? What kind of conclusions can we come to? And as of this recording, the BRICS summit will be taking place in Kazan, as I said, on the 22nd of October. So most likely you'll be listening to this episode after the BRICS summit has already concluded. And there will most likely be some decent resolutions coming out of this, given the fact that it is taking place in Russia, and President Putin personally has put a lot of weight on this particular Kazan summit meeting of BRICS. Rhetorically speaking, at least, he said some major economic development discussions will be held here. So what are your particular positions on this year for BRICS? Gennady, can you give us some insight?
Absolutely, Dmitry. 2024 has been a monumental year in BRICS with the almost doubling the size of the organization. And we're only 9 months in. So the organization is still digesting this news, digesting this change. But this year alone, for example, to give our viewers an understanding of how this organization operates, it really operates by, first and foremost, a number of ministerial and other governmental and international meetings between the members. So this year, there was a foreign ministers and special envoys to the Middle East meeting. So this is where they discussed in Moscow in April about the situation, the developing situation in Gaza and Israel and Lebanon. There was also a transport ministers meeting in St. Petersburg in June. There was a Supreme Audit Institutions meeting in Ufa on the 30th of June. There was an industry ministers meeting in Nizhny Novgorod in August. There was a Minister of Culture meeting on September in St. Petersburg. There was a Minister of Justice meeting in September in Moscow. And there was a Ministers of Labor and Employment meeting occurring in Sochi in September also. So you can see that you can imagine a platform where all of these ministerial representatives come and speak on a yearly basis, become acquainted with their peers, are able to build long-term strategy, feel out and learn and be personally introduced to their compatriots and their equivalents across this organization. This is really how BRICS functions. And on this platform, there can be multilateral ties, there can be organizational wide conclusions and positions taken, but there can also be bilateral ties and bilateral negotiations that occur. So it really sets the scene and really enables these countries to cooperate and communicate directly to advance their joint interests.
No, thank you for that very apt and succinct summary of 2024 and exactly what has taken place amongst this BRIC networking alliance, essentially, of very important countries. But one particular nation, I think, which interests our listeners very much is, frankly, the only very, very conservative. Now, I know Brazil and South Africa are majority Christian countries as well, but the only Orthodox Christian country who is a member of BRICS at the moment, and I know Ethiopians will say we're Orthodox Christian too, but with all due respect, my Oriental Orthodox brothers, we are a bit different in our theology, and let's not deny that at the moment. But let's not get into any theological subjects. The Russian Orthodox community of people are, of course, involved very heavily in BRICS. We can see even there'll be definitely a presence of Russian Orthodox leadership at the BRICS Kazan summit today. I think just the fact that all the members will be visiting and seeing the various cathedrals, mosques, and other points of interest in Kazan, a very key city. This is like a major Orthodox Christian city of all of Russia. So we all understand that and appreciate it. But what is Russia's role, Gennady, in this mosaic of nations? Because I think as the membership of BRICS expands, I think it's very key that Russia and the Russian Federation specifically is a key founding member. And in fact, the fact that the first BRICS summit took place in Yekaterinburg, I think is very important that the future multipolar world will have Russia at least at the helm or one of the founding countries, despite the fact that Russia, unfortunately today, is not one of these major leading economies, you can say, in terms of quantity, such as China and India, but still plays a very important role. So perhaps you can give us the scoop on what is Russia's particular role in BRICS and give us some details on its particular position in this network.
Quite frankly, Russia is the architect of this alternate framework of multilateral ties and multilateral development and South and East development of the global South and global East. So the first BRICS summit was in Yekaterinburg, as you've mentioned. The BRICS in general are as an outcome of Putin's 2007 Munich speech at the Security Council, where he really, for the first time, put these words into our vocabulary: global South, multipolarity, and things of that nature. And then and what I've mentioned is in 2015 in Ufa was another BRICS summit. And this summit actually was the first one that introduced many of these ministerial meetings that I just rattled off to you a minute ago that are happening in 2024. Many of these are actually the 8th and 9th consecutive meeting between ministerial leaders, with the first ones happening in Ufa in 2015. So we can see at every single stage that the Russians were really the pioneers of moving this organization forward. In 2022, they started the SMO, and then we saw a large amount of increase and interest in the BRICS organization with our list. I think over 20 countries have requested to join BRICS, with only 4 being accepted at the moment. And we can see this summit in 2024, rightfully, as you've mentioned, is the first summit of this stature of with this many global leaders that is occurring in a country that is so heavily sanctioned by the West. This is the first international summit of this stature, including this many global leaders from major countries, that is happening in a country that is so heavily sanctioned by the West. This is a complete overhaul of what we've seen historically, where countries like North Korea, countries like Iran, before that Iraq, were pariah states and not able to garner any international influence or real sympathies from their neighbors at risk of fear of Western sanctions. Whereas here in 2024 in Kazan, will see a new step forward, quite frankly, in global international relations with the number of world leaders that are coming to this summit. So apart from that, Russia's role, I really see this organization as a continuation of the sort of all of the best and most positive aspects of the Soviet foreign policy, looking to bring together nations in joint interest, looking to bring together nations in the global south and global east, and develop the proletariat, quite frankly, the working class, right? Something that is, you'll know better than I, but in my opinion, quite a Christian and positive endeavor. But at the same time, it manages to avoid all of the negative aspects of the Soviet Union, the real over enfranchisement with this idea of Marxism, the real eternal supplements and internal support that the Soviet Union was providing all of these countries, basically buying out their favor. Whereas in BRICS, there's no purchasing that's happening. It's simply just an organization that is in everybody's interest. But Russia is able to utilize this goodwill that it's built up over even its time as the Soviet Union and its peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union to really bring together countries and use this goodwill to positively shape the future of geopolitics and international relations. So Russia, look, really genuinely takes a central role in this organization, from hosting its founding meeting, from being founded quite, we at the initiative of Vladimir Putin, with the central, very important summit in Ufa in 2015, which really changed the trajectory and introduced the whole, really expanded the level of integration between the ministries of these countries, to now starting the SMO, and despite that, growing the organization by double almost, and having this milestone summit in Kazan 2024. I really do see that Russia is the architect of this organization, and we'll see where it takes it. Because first and foremost, it's a multilateral organization. Russia, nor China, nor India holds any sort of overwhelming majority in the decision making in this organization, and that's what really separates it from the Western institutions, whether it be NATO, whether it be the G7, the G20, whether it be the IMF, the World Bank, and to some extent the United Nations. If you only look where that is headquartered, the United States has taken an absolute leadership role in all of these organizations. They were really unilateral, unipolar institutions, all of them. Whereas here, for the first time, no one can clearly say who the most powerful entity here in BRICS is. Obviously, China economically, but I would say that Russia diplomatically, and India from the perspective of the medium and long-term economics, demographically, is the growing superpower. So none of these three countries are able to really claim dominance at this stage, and that makes this organization truly multipolar, and in my mind, a really healthy and well-built foundation upon which to continue development and relations between countries.
And that's a really optimistic and I think positive development in international relations, because that order that was developed, of course, after the Second World War, the unhealthy Cold War, which again plunged many people's minds into the depths of depression and created this false dialectic, as I think Jay Dyer covers very well in some of his lectures on, especially on the book Tragedy and Hope, which I know you've read and I've read, and it's just a wonderful book that kind of describes the 20th century really in depth. But the Cold War has produced this negativity and anxiety amongst nations and created this false dialectic between the capitalist and the communist Marxist world, which now, unfortunately, it shattered in such a bizarre way in the 1990s. But since then, of course, we see healthy powers, people actually sobering up and coming to the realization that actually there are multiple civilizations and there are multiple pathways of cultural development and economic development that nations may have. And there's a way to diplomatically and through mutually beneficial trade actually nations can benefit one another. So it sounds like it's common sense, right, in today's world. But no, unfortunately, the United States, through its very heavy dominance, and of course, we know the US and the Federal Reserve since 1913, what kind of impact that has had on even the American people, on the fiat dollar system in general. That's almost like its own 8 hour should be dedicated to that particular the dollar and what fiat even is, right, in its sort of soul and its essence. But with all this taken into account, Gennady, can you describe some of the difficulties that BRICS faces today as it stands in 2024, given its almost decade long, over a decade long of its history, and some of the hurdles and some of the roadblocks that it may face very soon in the future? What are some of the troubles that BRICS is in at the moment and some of the challenges?
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question. I think one of the main challenges conceptually of this organization is that it does have competing interests within itself. So if we were to compare it to the G7, broadly the West, the golden billionaires we would know them today, they're really quite aligned. They're all developed countries. They're all seafaring nations broadly. They all share the same hemisphere, the same geographic location, you could say, across the Atlantic Ocean. They face each other. They're all broadly importers of energy, which is a huge deal in economics. Apart from the United States, which has historically been a major importer of energy, however, recently has turned that around and has been a major exporter with the shale oil and gas revolutions. These countries have a lot of similarities, a common language, even a common cultural identity, which is very, very important. A common interest, the concept of themselves, and then the other, a unified concept of the other is very important. So what the BRICS has to overcome is the fact that, one, they are geographically separated. Now with these new additions, it's been much more, that's been greatly eased because a lot of these additions have been on this sort of Eurasian African continent there with Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, and so forth. So it's now more centralized around that, which is great. However, these countries are still at odds with each other across various points. We know that Ethiopia and Egypt have some issues among themselves with the dam that's being built. In Ethiopia, we know that India and China are, have minor skirmishes across themselves, but also, quite frankly, are going to be major, almost swapped is the expectation in terms of economic powerhouse over the next 100 years. So we'll see how that comes into play. And at the same time, we have major importers and exporters of energy. So it's almost like these countries are coming together with, for everything good and against everything bad, but we're really yet to see that quite solidify into quantifiable policies, apart from a few cases. So there are a few great cases, like the ignoration of the sanctions regime coming from the West. That's a great policy. The increase of trading in each other's currencies and using local currencies for trade. That's a very common. That's a very great benefit. But we're really yet to see, apart from talk, major progress for a common currency, for example, any alternatives to the US dollar or any major new trade routes or really like major steps forward into realizing these cross-continental spanning projects that the BRICS have been talking about. Now, they're definitely picking up steam, but I'm saying that there's room to grow. The next decade, the next 2 decades, needs to see significant amount of work building that out with the Severny Morskoy Puts, the northern sea routes that are happening across Russia, and the north-south trading corridor coming through Azerbaijan, Iran, between basically connecting Russia and India, and then moving onwards to Western Europe or Eastern Europe and China. So really being an alternative to the Egyptian Suez Canal and the traditional trade route of the decades that are past. So these are key points to watch, but I think that's some of the difficulties that the BRICS nations will face is, are they able to really solidify this concept of themselves as a joint unit or a joint platform? And I guess to some extent you need a concept of the other, which is good that exists in the personification of the West. And hopefully that sort of stops the spread of some liberalist ideas and some real progressive LGBT, et cetera, ideas. Hopefully that also protects from that. But I think that we're still in the early days of this organization. This organization really needs to digest the new member states and really prove that it can find points of contact, points of communal interest, mutual interest between such varying people cultures, geographic locations, histories. Quite frankly, with that in mind, it's almost an alternative to the United Nations, which it may potentially evolve into. However, it's far too early to tell. So there's definitely a lot of difficulties that, unfortunately for us, will take decades to unravel, and we'll have to watch closely and read between the lines and listen to World War Now to get the latest news about all of these.
No, absolutely in agreement with you on that last point there. But generally speaking, I completely agree here. And it would be a very promising prospect if the United Nations would be replaced with something a bit more productive, because the UN has frankly not assisted. I mean, we see them not really assisting Gaza, Palestinians, or any of the other struggling nations. Remember the massacre that took place in Rwanda in the 1990s as well? The UN failed to act and failed to really stop that major genocide that took place between the locals and that particular Central African zone. But I think generally speaking, there's some really promising things on the horizon for BRICS. And on that particular subject, what would be your professional opinion, Gennady, being someone who works in economics, literally makes a living in this particular sphere, and given that you analyze, you read the news, you take all this really complex information in and you synthesize it in a very common language, especially for us listeners who aren't essentially economists by profession and by education, how would you explain the future of BRICS? What would your prognosis be if we get into slight futurism? Maybe give us the realistic outlook on what the potential next few years could look like for this BRICS membership, because let's just say Saudi Arabia joins officially by the end of the year, bringing the number to 10. What could we look at? An expansion of potential nations, a further consolidation, or potentially even a dormancy, given the so-called coming recession in the global economy, which so many people are again speaking about, the crash of the dollar, etc. But generally speaking, what would be the prognosis of BRICS and this wonderful organization and forum, which is only developing and which is now has really marked itself as one of the greatest things that the 21st century has really given us?
Yeah, no, that's a hard question. But look, I think any analysis is only worth as much as its prediction. I think it's very important to make predictions for our listeners to sort of come back to keep in mind and assess our analysis based on. I'll take a middle ground approach in terms of pessimism or optimism in my prediction for BRICS. I think a realistic approach is what I would call it. I think the organization really needs to digest the new members that it's going to take. I think there's probably going to be a pause on new memberships, at least in the short term. I think there'll likely be instead a new member type created, maybe some sort of observer member type that's created without full membership into BRICS, but some sort of observer status for which a large amount of countries can be inducted into or given this level of access or this membership level into the organization. That will still allow access to all these forums, but will actually not paralyze the organization in the case that it wants to continue to develop like something like a joint currency or a revival of the CRA or the New Development Bank. Not every single country has the means or the specialists or the interest to join all of these organizations in full, but I think they'll be welcomed into the organization as a platform, the platform which the organization provides. I think there'll be a new member status, there'll be increased membership there, but I think the core unit of countries, these wealthy countries, these countries that are building this new 100 years ahead of us, will probably want to limit and reestablish themselves and sort of recalibrate about what the future may hold, especially in this time of uncertainty where, quite frankly, there could be a calamity in the South China Sea. We already see on the brink of war with Iran. We already see a hot war on the third year of a hot war in Europe. I think this organization will be important to maintain these multilateral ties and keep these countries coming together. But I don't see them making any drastic moves in the next couple of years. I think at this stage, there's also too much vetted interest in the US dollar being around. There's just in the minds of our leaders, in the minds of economists and financiers, there's really no alternative to the US dollar. There needs to be a change in generation almost for that to come into effect. And there's too much foreign currency reserves held by all countries. So nobody's interests for the US dollar to collapse in the short term. Not China's, not India's, not South Africa's, not Brazil's, not Saudi Arabia's or United Arab Emirates. I think there's sort of, in the short term, there's going to be definite consolidation, definite increase in foreign trade, increase in bilaterally and multilaterally interesting projects. There'll be increase in trade denominated in local currencies, which is very, very important. But I think BRICS, I really think of it as a sort of organization of this century. So if we were to look a bit more further ahead, that's a very hard thing to do. But I think that, after a huge, it depends if the world breaks up into multipolarity peacefully or after a great war. If the United States and the Anglo-Saxons broadly step away from their positions and establish themselves as part of the of the global world order and basically step back to the lines of AUKUS, Australia, UK, Canada, United States, they will be a pole in this multipolar world, and they'll be at the table together with BRICS. Maybe there'll be some joining with BRICS if the United States were to step away, or maybe BRICS will continue to exist and the United Nations will be revitalized because the United States will be basically acting responsibly on the global sphere. However, if there is a great war or multiple great wars that break out at the same time, then all bets are off. I don't know what will happen in that case or who. It's a horrible thing to think about, but I think BRICS will have an important role to play as a sort of counterweight to the G7, to the G20, to NATO at the end of the day, and really enable collaboration on the Eurasian continent and hopefully reduce the level of suffering. And then in any case, it'll have a very large role to play in the world post-war. And that's when we can talk about things like a new BRICS currency backed by gold, backed by whatever it may be, industrial production. But I don't see that BRICS currency coming to effect in the sort of the near term up to the next 5 years. I think that at best, maybe the starting of the work upon currency for international trade, not something that you and I can hold, but a sort of a unit of accounts that the central banks will hold. And that will facilitate foreign reserves, act as foreign reserves, and facilitate foreign trade. So a bit of a roundabout answer there, Dmitry, but a very hard question you've posed and a very interesting one to ponder about.
Thank you, Gennady, for that really deep insight into the future of BRICS. Now, I think without further ado, we will move towards Russia to speak more about Russian economics and, of course, how the Russian fossil fuel raw energy market interacts with the global trade. And of course, we know based on geopolitics and the recent news, and as well as those of you, dear listeners, who already, have really well tapped into our World War Now episodes, you know how important gas, oil trade, and the trade of raw resources is to Russia and the entire Eurasian continent. And even beyond that, frankly, we see most of geopolitics, of course, expands and works on these major economic resources, right? Which in Russia's case is, of course, gas and oil. But of course, we'll discuss more industry than just that, which runs in Russia, especially some of the major companies such as Rosatom. We'll speak about uranium and some of the more interesting minerals that Russia, fortunately, has the opportunity to exploit in order to expand its economy. So, Gennady, thank you for joining me this evening. It's been a really busy time in the world economic scene. We know the Kazan BRICS Forum is coming up, and generally we know one of the things people will be discussing behind closed doors is, of course, gas and oil. So perhaps you could give us some insight into exactly what the Russian energy market is like.
Thank you, Dmitry. Yes, absolutely. The Kazan BRICS Summit is on our nose, so to speak. So we'll have another episode about that, running into some detail about some history and some projections about BRICS. But very excited today to talk about Russia's energy exports. So for all who don't know or who haven't thought about it, energy is the absolute basis of all economic activity. Anything healthcare, life expectancy, any quality of life measure is absolutely based on the abundance and cheap energy resources. So Russia's in a unique position where it really takes a leading role in a lot of the sectors around the world. So we'll take a look at that, how that looks from an export perspective on the global market, as well from an internal Russian economic development perspective as well. So a very interesting episode that we have today. We're going to be going through the topics one by one. So there's 4 topics in total. So we're going to be starting off with natural gas, then moving into oil, then coal, and then uranium. So very excited to have the chance to speak about that today. Thank you very much, Dmitry.
Awesome. All right. So starting off with gas, of course, we understand all the early scandals between the oligarchs and Putin. We understand especially Khodorkovsky is the most famous one, right? And, all the oligarchs who controlled the gas and oil resources eventually lost control of them in the early 2000s. But we know they made quite a buck in the 1990s and the early 2000s until President Putin, of course, took control of all these major resources and essentially made them public again, right? Returned them to the Russian people, to the Russian citizens, and they began bringing in crazy amounts of revenue. Like we know the Russian GDP increased to something like 7 to 8% growth over the early 2000s, all the way up until the 2007-2008 crisis. But perhaps you could expand on the aspect of gas in particular in the sort of scheme of the Russian economy, because we know Russia, like the largest country in the world, largest landmass, and this is even after the breakup of the Russian Empire, the dissolution of the USSR. The landmass is still quite massive. There's gas all over Siberia, central Russia, around the Ural Mountains, and of course, even in parts of central Russia and even in the tundra. So there's gas basically everywhere. And these, as you call them in Russian, месторождения, basically places of origin of gas, are now being very methodically and precisely exploited by major Russian gas companies. Now, there's several of them, and I think you can kind of break down exactly how much revenue each one of these massive corporations and companies bring in. And of course, we have to keep in mind, these aren't just, Russian bureaucrats, oligarchs control these particular gas companies, and it's making the rich richer in Russia and building up a new oligarch class. We have to be a bit more optimistic. These massive gas corporations and gas sort of exploiting companies, they not only provide jobs to the local people, but also bring financing to the regions wherein that gas is actually extracted from the ground. So in fact, there's a lot of probably benefits collectively, not just through the sale of gas, but also through the very nature of its exploitation out of the earth. So a very interesting, of course, we're not big believers in global warming here on World War Now, so as you already know. But Gennady, perhaps you could give us some more in-depth information about gas, exactly what the revenue is like with Russia and how this all comes together.
Absolutely, Dmitry. You've touched on a number of very interesting topics. I think the best place to start off is with the questions that you've raised, is actually looking at the companies themselves and maybe looking at the Russian energy sector as a whole in that case, because you have mentioned the sort of de-oligarchization that's been happening over the last 20 years. That no doubt has taken place. However, it's important to, while being optimistic, also be realistic that there is still very large oligarchs that tightly hold quite sizable companies within these oil and gas industries. And it's actually a very nuanced field of play. So something that's been very carefully put together by Putin and the Russia's leadership. And I'll go through as to why. It's very interesting. So, for example, look at the natural gas and oil sector. We have the two main players in gas is Gazprom and Novatek. So Gazprom is actually more than 50% owned by the Russian government. So it's a public-private company. So it's traded on the stock exchange. So anyone can freely purchase shares in Gazprom, as they can with Novatek, but the Russian government owns over 50%, 50% plus one share. So they have the controlling packet of shares, and are therefore, as the majority shareholder, are able to direct the company as they see fit. Novatek, on the other hand, is actually only minority government owned. About only 5% of the shares, the floated shares that anyone can purchase on the stock exchange, Moscow Stock Exchange, are owned by the government. And about 51% are owned by the various oligarchs and management positions within the company. You can see that just as a little example in the gas field, that there's a bit of a duopoly there in terms of the major gas producers, and there's a bit of a different approach for each one. Similar can be seen in the oil sector, where, for example, Rosneft is 70% owned by the Russian government, but then there are other companies like Lukoil, which is actually completely in private hands, with 31% of the shares being owned by management. So these are the oligarchs that we see, the various directors, the various previous directors, many of which have actually left their positions from February 2022 to try and avoid sanctions. But many companies are not in Russian government hands. So the way to think about it is that approximately half the companies in the big players are government controlled, and about half are minority or have no government control over them. So this is a very interesting thing. And I think that this is the lessons that are learned from the Soviet days. So I think there's a couple of reasons why this is chosen as a strategy, because it definitely is chosen as a strategy. Back in the 90s, the level of private ownership in these companies was higher still. And there has been a reversal, deprivatization of many companies. And the Russian government has exerted its will across the private sector in the oil and gas space. However, it has stopped short of fully taking control over the sector in a sort of Soviet centrally planned way. And I think there's a couple of good reasons for that. The first reason is, first of all, plausible deniability. for any sort of actions. So I do believe that these companies do work together on the global sphere, on the global scale. So some they basically carve up the globe and the various gas fields and the various export partners and opportunities with various states and various technological imports and their own innovation that they need. So this allows the Russian government to sort of advance its interests in various parts of the globe while maintaining plausible deniability of a certain company remaining in private hands and having no formal Russian government interference or sort of input into that. The second reason why I think this is done is simply that market economics are very important. It's very important to maintain a sort of system where strong results are rewarded. So these companies do compete with each other. They compete with each other for the favor of the leadership. They compete for each other in economic activity, in entrepreneurship, and various technological development. So this is very important where it's not a sort of stagnating field. If one company was to excel, it would get a larger share of various government contracts, of government contacts, and various other types of work, and would be allowed to sort of take a few steps ahead of other companies and then entice these other companies to then succeed and move forward as well. And I think third reason is to complicate any sort of foreign intelligence activities that are taking interest in the Russian economic sphere and in the Russian natural gas and oil export or all these spheres in general. When there is a multiple sort of diffused decision making, it's very hard to penetrate. And therefore, the Russian government is able to maneuver itself and is able to influence and maneuver these companies all across the globe, in China, in Venezuela, in Iran, in northern Siberia, and the Arctic Circle, in Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Africa, quite frankly, which is becoming much more pertinent in today's world. All these companies sort of take their separate niches, and then it's impossible to sort of see the full picture, or it becomes much more difficult to see the full picture from a foreign influence and foreign espionage perspective.
Wow, that's very interesting. One of the aspects I think that's really caught my eye here is that you have these very strongly public companies, which perhaps, and I would say theoretically, because again, I'm not even sure if their salaries, right, of what they pay their employees, especially the managers, the corporate leadership, are even made public. But I can imagine that if you're on a board of directors of, say, Gazprom, which is, as you said, 50.1% say government owned, right? The Russian Federation has strong control over Gazprom, one of the major natural gas corporations in Russia. You can imagine the salary of Gazprom may hypothetically be, given that it is majority public, maybe less than, say, another gas company like Novatek, which is mostly private, right? Theoretically, because we do know in economics there is, or even in the sort of Western world, in this first and second world, there is this trend of, well, public service jobs pay significantly less than private sector jobs, right? And so theoretically, even there is a meritocratic system wherein Russia can develop its own sort of collective of professional managers of these major companies, engineers, people who work in, perhaps begin work in a larger public company like Gazprom, and through their skill, through meritocracy, they can then move up the ladder, and perhaps they can even, through developing their resume over the last, say, 20 years, because it's been a while, it's an entire generation, people have worked in these massive gas and oil post-Soviet companies, they can then develop their resumes and their experience and then move up the ladder, may perhaps work or receive employment at these major private corporations, and like Novatek, for example, or even Lukoil, right, which is completely private. And then can you imagine their pay probably goes up dramatically, right? So it's quite interesting sort of system inbuilt in order to, I suppose, promote innovation and incentivize the Russian people to work harder in these particular industries, right? To like, okay, look, there's a particular ladder of movement here, right? A certain way of pushing your career forward, perhaps in this particular industry. Maybe that's a plus as well. But you're right, in terms of, I think the other major, very key aspect is, for example, we know that India has been purchasing illegally, going against the so-called sanctions that are placed on Russia, illegally has been purchasing Russian crude oil, and it's still somewhat untraceable as to which particular Russian oil company. Was it Tatneft, Lukoil, Rosneft, who was selling this crude oil for a lot higher of a price than what was set according to the threshold by the so-called international community to India. But because the Russian government could sort of track the KPI and the performance of these various oil companies, the directors could meet with directly with government bureaucrats in very high positions, like even the prime minister or the deputy premier, and they could, behind closed doors, based on the performance of one of these semi-private or semi-public companies, they could give them a contract with India, maybe the Indian state or other Indian industries who wish to purchase this oil. And so then one of these companies could then supply sort of unofficially behind closed doors this oil to India and then produce, of course, more revenue, increase sort of key performance indicators, KPI goes up, everybody benefits. But in order to receive that local patent to sell oil so-called illegally against the international community guidelines, that particular oil company would need to prove itself first. So I guess there is that competition, right? You mentioned market economics, the sort of basic macro microeconomic framework. And so these companies do need to, I guess, compete against one another in order to receive these top secret missions from the Russian government, potentially in order to fulfill these orders from maybe states which are sanctioned, such as Iran. Although Iran does have its own oil, we know that Iran's oil export actually has gone down significantly since the Iranian Revolution for various reasons. Or maybe sanctioned countries such as North Korea. Who knows who sells oil to them in particular? But one of these corporations could, in particular, be hired in order to sell them oil for a particular contract or a set time. So I completely agree. The market economic standards of competition apply even to this mix of public and private majority owned massive giant corporations of gas and oil in Russia. So it's very interesting how that works, both like in the foreign policy scheme, of sort of world economics, and of course internally as well, as the employees compete against one another for these key positions in very high paying, lucrative corporate roles in the Russian world. Because in order to actually become an oligarch, you have to kind of build yourself up. If that's even possible, the only way to do that would be to perhaps even jump from company to company, learning the ins and outs and all the shortcuts and professional know-how of the oil gas industry in Russia. Because again, it's not very simple in managing thousands of people as well as these huge revenue streams. So super important. And just some interesting factors maybe people don't take into account when they see these massive gatherings of corporate leaders in Russia, or like the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, and you see all these people in suits gathering there. It's probably to consider these sort of things, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, that's a very nice way to put it. And in terms of the oligarchs, I'd say that I'd like to elaborate a little bit on the de-oligarchization that's been happening. One good example of that is Tatneft. Tatneft, so Tatarstan Neft, Tatarstan Oil, a region of Russia, is an example of really the Wild West that was happening in the 90s, where a previously government-owned company, as everything was in the Soviet Union, was completely privatized to the son of the governor with the stroke of the pen, with absolutely no fees being paid, nothing being paid to the government, just a government decision to privatize the company in favor of the son of the governor of the region. After which point the company was sold for a price of $2 billion back in the 1990s, after which the family quickly fled the country basically, and shortly after that, and are living in Western Europe ever since. And this is an absolutely appalling example, and unfortunately things that have been happening far too frequently in the 90s, and something that Putin inherited. So Putin inheriting this situation basically then forcibly made the company public and then resold it on to private hands. However, with the proceeds being now going to the government's coffers formally and being able to be used to reinvest into the region. So we've seen Putin basically, if in the Soviet Union was completely government owned, everything was publicly owned, there was 10 steps towards privatization, and we've seen Putin sort of take 3 steps back towards the center ground. So we're not quite, or maybe 3 or 4 steps back towards the center ground. So we're kind of in this mixed market economy where the government is able to have central planning to a large extent in very key fields, but the market forces are very much preserved, and there's very much space for entrepreneurship and private success as well. And this extends into other fields as well: airlines, shipbuilding, car manufacturing, and all various types of fields, which maybe one day we'll discover as well. But it's sort of a general strategy of Vladimir Putin, probably with his liberal ideas, balancing his Soviet upbringing. That's very much been the economic policy that he's been putting in place for the past 20, 25 years. And unfortunately, something that he's had to work on, inheriting a very much broken system in the late 90s, in December 1999 when he came to power, very much a broken system that he's had to remedy. And it's kind of fallen into place almost naturally to where it is now, with limited sort of interventions, quite frankly. He's not gone overboard, and he's absolutely not, he's in no way reestablishing a centrally planned economy in any way that was similar to the Soviet Union.
Gennady, what would be the particulars of the natural gas industry? Like, if we're going to get really into the crux of it, because we hear a lot of news stories, typically they don't really explain exactly what even a gas pipeline is. What are these billion cubic meters of gas? What does that mean? What is Nord Stream 1 or 2? What kind of pipelines even are there? Like, how many pipelines are there? How important are these major pipelines, especially? Because what's the difference between a big pipe and a series of small pipes, for example? Or what is the point? Why can't gas be transferred, for example, in some sort of canisters or cylinders? You actually need an actual pipe, similar to how you would transport, say, water and gas to a regular housing unit. So these massive gas pipelines literally need to transcend almost entire continents and countries, right? So we have literally a gas pipeline from Siberia, from Asia, all the way into Europe. And of course, you have Nord Stream 1 and 2. We hear a lot about the Suja gas metering station in Ukraine, currently, not Ukraine, sorry, in Kursk, currently occupied by the Ukrainian armed forces during the Kursk occupation, still unfortunately in their hands as per the recording of this episode. But in particular, looking north towards the Baltics, we do have the Nord Stream 1 explosion, and of course the Nord Stream 2 project, which simply was never built in the first place, which sabotaged the entire German economy. So maybe can we get into the details of what exactly natural gas is and essentially how the industry works in the Russian context, of course, because we know these gas pipelines exist in various countries, various continents, but Russia is one of the largest producers of natural gas and one of the major exporters. So, and Russia, of course, is interesting to us as this major geopolitical player.
Absolutely. So natural gas is one of the key elements of energy generation. It's also very much used for warmth. So it's really taken over in electricity generation, and now is a sizable portion, up to 30% of all electricity generated across the globe is via natural gas, not to mention all of the use in cooking and heating and things like that. So natural gas is an interesting market because it's almost two separate markets in and of itself. The first one you've mentioned is pipelines. So pipelines require a large amount of initial investment to set up, right? A pipeline can span hundreds or thousands or even more kilometers, frequently across continents, through mountain ranges, under the sea, or across borders. A pipeline, after it's initially been set up, it's basically then it has very low overhead costs to run. It's almost turning the valve, yeah, and then the gas comes out the other end. We do, however, have a second market in natural gas, or a second delivery method, which has increased in popularity over the last 40 years, and that's liquefied natural gas. The liquefied natural gas is when gas is cooled to negative 166 degrees, it becomes liquid, and then it condenses by 1,000 times. So you can imagine a whole cavern of natural gas can then be stored in a barrel or a storage unit, a cryogenic storage unit, which needs to maintain this temperature. However, special ships are built with these storage units, which maintain the temperature. And then these ships are able to go and move around enormous capacities of gas across the globe to anywhere where there is a distillation system that is set up, usually in ports for many countries. So Germany has really been building these after the end of pipeline gas supply from Russia, has really been expanding its liquefied natural gas import infrastructure. The other interesting thing about natural gas is it has a tendency to dissipate in the atmosphere. So storing it is a major, major problem. It's not inert, it has a tendency to dissipate. So it's not like oil where you can just simply build or have large amounts of barrels or build large containers for oil. You cannot do this easily with gas because you either have to have an absolutely enormous area, just unfathomably large, to have gas in its gas-like state, or you have to expend electricity to maintain it in its cryogenic negative 166 degree state, which is just not economically feasible. With gas, it's a much tighter market that is much more tightly managed to supply and demand for each individual country. And very few countries have geographic features like underground caverns themselves, which can be used to store gas. Typically, these are only in places where natural gas previously existed and has since been used up by humanity. These porous earth, these caverns, broadly speaking, can then be refilled with natural gas. But very few countries have them, and they can't store anywhere near 100% of a country's annual gas usage. Usually it's between 5 and 15%, if at all. So really it's almost like an emergency supply rather than something that a country can rely on for a whole year or things like that. So we see there's much more volatility in natural gas prices, whereas oil, there's more broadly a unified market across the globe, and volatility is, ranges between, plus minus $5-10 maximum. Natural gas over the past years has actually fluctuated by hundreds of percentage points up and down with various disruptions that are happening across the globe. So the interesting thing, so we're talking about Russia and its gas supply. So Russia is about 50-50 in terms of its LNG and pipeline gas exports or export capability. However, unfortunately, over the last 3 years, we've really seen a reduction in the westward supply of pipeline gas. So this is due to the European Union simply introducing legislation that limits the amount of fossil fuels and natural gas in particular that they can import from Russia. This has had a whole manner of problems for the European economy and German economy in particular, which we'll go into potentially. But for Russia, it's actually meant that about half of its natural gas exports have significantly reduced, almost down to zero, which is very, very sizable. So if I would just get my stats out here, it was a total of 190 billion cubic meters of gas that was sent to the West in 2019. And unfortunately, this has reduced down to about 78 billion cubic meters in 2023, with the only major pipelines now going through Turkey, the two southern Turk Stream and Blue Stream pipelines being the only two pipelines that are anywhere near 100% capacity. What I'd like to add is just listing them, I think is very important. So in the north, there's the Nord Stream pipeline. So we obviously know the Nord Stream 1 and 2, both blown up. Nord Stream 2 unfortunately never came online. Nord Stream 1 was the real backbone of the German gas supply, has now come to a complete halt with the terrorist attack that we saw a couple of years ago. Next, we see Yamal Europe. So that goes through Belarus and onto Poland. So that actually has ended. The re-export from Belarus to Poland has completely ended. So that pipeline is now just going to Belarus and that ends there. And then we have the Soyuz and Brotherhood pipelines that go through Ukraine. So these pipelines have been in operation for 70 odd years. So well into the Soviet days, these pipelines were established. And these pipelines were the real reason why Ukraine was the economic powerhouse of the Soviet Union. Because the way that the Soviet Union developed is they created these humongous pipelines from the northern Arctic through to Western Europe, which was the most richest market and could pay the highest premium for gas across the globe. And first and foremost, this export founded the state government coffers. But second of all, it enabled development throughout the course of these huge pipelines, where additions would be added and whole new manufacturing hubs could be created, which were electrified and heated via the gas pipelines, or this gas that was coming through the pipelines from this essentially unlimited amount of natural gas that exists in the northern Arctic. Hence, Ukraine was able to have a car manufacturing sector with multiple major companies producing millions of cars per year, a shipbuilding sector, a plane building sector producing the Maria planes, amongst others. The largest planes built by humanity were built in Ukraine, and the rocket engine manufacturing. I think up until the 2010s, American astronauts were going into space on Ukrainian rockets because the Russian rockets were actually, the rocket engines themselves were constructed in Ukraine and then exported to Russia to then send Americans to space. So these pipelines were the absolute backbone of the Russian economy and the Ukrainian economy and even the Western economy, because of the West European economy, because they were able to get such cheap natural gas relative to other markets. So if we were to think about Southeast Asia, for example, why is Germany more industrialized than Indonesia or Thailand? There are many reasons, but one of the reasons is that there is essentially a direct pipeline that was able to pump up to 200 billion cubic meters of gas at a very low cost. The energy prices in Germany were 3 or 4 times less than they were in Southeast Asia, which had to go through the arduous process of liquefying and then condensing, the natural gas imports, being an order of magnitude more expensive there. That's the peculiars of the natural gas industry.
That's super interesting. As we kind of like read through history, even like the history of the Second World War, we realize energy being super important. Like, unfortunately, the Red Army, for example, failed to stop the Third Reich's exploitation of Romanian oil, which was like a major part. Like the Red Army actually had submarines in the Black Sea, and the Romanian fleet was very small. But for whatever reason, the Black Sea fleet was not motivated enough to continue its raids on the Romanian coast, and so Germany, the Third Reich, essentially, and all of Central Europe, kind of united under Hitler's leadership. They kept exploiting Romanian oil, and that was one of the reasons why the Third Reich continued to run its tanks and industries and factories generally quite efficiently, considering they were only 10 years old at most at that point, after the Weimar sort of the destruction of German industry in general. But also at that time, gas wasn't really a major factor in the 1930s and 40s. Primarily, as you said, electricity was produced by coal. And coal, of course, coal naturally, fortunately for the Western and Central European countries, the reason even why Germany, once it united in the 1800s under Bismarck and the Prussian Kaiser, the reason why Germany rose up industrially and its population literally increased by 50 million people. The Russian population also increased by a lot during that span, but during the 1800s. But one of the reasons was because of the large amount of coal it had on German territory, as well as all the mountains of Europe were full of coal, and of course Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, etc. Like Germans could buy very cheap coal, and of course the industry began. So this is when industrialization was just kind of forming itself and pumping the German economy very strongly during World War I and II. But now we see that the post-Marshall Plan now unified Germany, even post the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the USSR, very strongly began depending on a new, efficient, and you can say almost cleaner and cheaper form of energy, which is of course gas. And this is why the Nord Stream 1 and 2 essentially failed projects. By failed, I mean they were essentially, as you said, they were blown up by Western intelligence. The globalists chose not to go ahead of Nord Stream 2. And of course, Nord Stream 1 is one of the, I guess, largest conspiracies of recent years, if people even consider the amount of money and the amount of just the, I suppose, even energy that was lost since then. I think it's surprising that there aren't many more stories written about Nord Stream 1 and exactly who has done it and the reason why it's not being properly investigated. It's just, it really shows you out of which head the horns grow, so to speak, as the Russian proverb goes. But it's also interesting, like, you mentioned the various gas pipelines, the various countries they run through. Like you mentioned South Stream running through the Black Sea next past Turkey, and of course the Blue Stream as well. And it kind of explains, notice Turkey most likely, Gennady, it also taps into these massive gas pipelines. They don't just run through Turkey in order to get to Europe. They also energize Turkey itself, Anatolia, that entire massive peninsula. And so the Turks benefit from it, which then the Russians haven't. That's one thing Russia has not done since the beginning of the SMO, is turn the gas off. Right? And many have criticized the United Russia and Putin and his party for not turning off the gas during essentially what can be only described as a civilizational war, which shows a very unique approach of Moscow and the Kremlin to this conflict, as in they're taking it as a sort of, essentially as a proper humanitarian special military intervention, not as a proper war, is similar to that which took place during the Second World War, which was essentially like a total war, and all links and ties to the West, to Central Europe, had to be broken between the USSR, and there was no cooperation whatsoever. Here we still see cooperation, sales, contracts essentially being upheld between Russia and the West and Central Europe, which is super curious. But and again, of course, Kharkov, the other very interesting city, it's literally located between the Soyuz and the Brotherhood pipelines, right, running through Ukraine. And Kharkov, historically, even before these pipelines even appeared during the USSR, was a major industrial base of the entire Malorossia, Novorossiya region. During the Russian Empire, this is where the major truck factories, car factories, car manufacturing began there. I believe they were even potentially producing some of the earliest World War I era planes there. At least there was all kinds of industry booming around Kharkov, which is why it's the second largest city in all of modern Ukraine, you can say. And of course, during the USSR, that only expanded, and they were producing all kinds of high-tech industrial goods and things which, frankly, unfortunately, now Ukraine simply cannot reproduce after the dissolution of the USSR due to Ukrainianization, and their privatization was in some ways even worse than that of the Russian Federation. But yeah, just very curious how these sort of things align, and historically we can see this major reliance on energy and how energy export actually can impact foreign policy and how countries view one another, right? So America not depending on Russian energy, on gas or oil in any way, there's almost no connection, because the US is also very energy rich. It can sort of almost contain its own foreign policy and almost in an aggressive adversarial fashion always view Russia and the Russian Federation, the USSR or the Russian Empire as its geopolitical opponents because there is no codependence there, you can almost say. But that's curious because, Turkey at the moment has taken a very neutral stance. The gas is still turned on into Turkey, and as well at countries like Austria, Hungary, because there are massive gas pipelines like the Yamal Europe pipeline going through Belarus that leads right into Hungary and Austria and Slovakia, etc., all the way to Italy. We see these countries behaving themselves, so to speak, and even in the European Parliament, they're very, you can say, somewhat even pro-Russian. And perhaps the AfD in Germany, you can see that the very conservative right-wing party, they're also trying to bolster pro-Russian relations. Potentially, if the right wing takes over again in Germany, we won't see Russophobia. In fact, we'll see Russophilia in order to re-establish some sort of gas pipeline connection, perhaps a Nord Stream 2 type project, against the will of the globalists. But who knows? I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. But yeah, gas exports, you mentioned, super important. And naturally, the convenience of them is just cannot be understated. As you said, it's literally you build a pipeline, you invest in it. Of course, governments have a lot of resources, which is why probably a lot of these pipelines are not privately funded, or most of them, it appears that they're government funded. So the initial project is a government run, invested pipeline, right? So the government funds it or takes out a loan, hundreds of billions of dollars at times. And of course, then perhaps the particular gas exploitation zone is then privately controlled. So it's a very interesting form of selling this particular energy resource. So, in fact, a very crucial and important element. And I'm glad we're really getting into the details on it.
Yeah, so Russia is the second largest exporter of natural gas, only after the United States as of 2019. So the other major players are Qatar, Australia, and Norway in this space, with different players having different amounts of pipeline and LNG export compositions. For example, Australia is 100% LNG. There's not a single pipeline that goes from Australia anywhere else. It's entirely liquefied natural gas that's exported from the место рождения, the places of origin of the gas, to the eventual consumer. I wanted to just touch on a few things, or touch on one thing that you mentioned in terms of the continuation of export, the willingness of the Russian Federation to continue to export natural gas. And I think there's two reasons for that. The first reason is there is a deficit of US dollars or euros in the Russian economy. There is still a need for this. And these companies represent a huge avenue of receiving this currency, which can then be used to purchase a whole manner of other goods. In today's world, there's simply no alternative to US dollars and euros for many countries, despite the ruble and the BRICS countries increasing their trade in local currencies by orders of magnitude. It's still in the teens of the overall global trade. The majority of the global trade, teens of percentages I'm talking about, the majority of overall global trade is in euros and USD. So these are still needed in today's day and age. And the second reason I think is that Putin maintains a sort of vision where this conflict can be overcome and there can be a peace with Europe. And if right-wing parties, so to speak, come to power, Russia needs to maintain its sort of air of respectability amongst these parties, or maybe to enable them to also to come to power as well, where when these powers come to office, they'll be able to say that, look, Russia has, continued and been willing to cooperate, etc., be a trade partner and follow the expected laws and regulations of international relations, conventions of international relations, and then they can continue to cooperate and build together. So whether or not that's a smart policy, time will tell. But looking at some of the effects of, some of the political change in Europe, it very well may be. We'll see. It'll take another 5 years or so to unfold, I think. And just a couple of interesting points before we move on. In terms of, for example, Turkey, there was a very interesting project in Turkey to actually build a gas trading hub, a formal hub across the globe, which would take in Russian pipeline gas and then a whole bunch of international LNG exports, put them all into the same sort of virtual computer system. And then from then on, it could re-export them to anywhere in the world. Then it could all go to Europe, for example. And then, who would be able to tell which elements of gas had autocratic Russian origin or which had democratic Qatarian origin? No one would be able to tell. But this project has actually been completely stopped, and with huge pressure from the USA, they've been forced to stop this project, despite it very much being in their own interest. And I think this is an example of what you were saying, where the United States is an exporter of all fossil fuels, of all energy resources, really taking an interest in trying to choke out the Russian exports to Western Europe in particular. To the rest of the world as much as possible, but that doesn't seem to be possible to at least Western Europe, where it can then enter the market and then have a monopolistic sort of relationship as an energy exporter to this very rich part area of the world. Before we move on, I'd like to just cover some more liquefied natural gas or some alternatives for the Russian and West European exports. The Russian export of natural gas to the West Europeans. They're saying that this gas has greatly reduced. It's reduced by 3 or 4 fold and is likely to reduce further in 2024 as the numbers update for the year. What's the alternatives? Is there really any progress that's being made in other directions that is able to cover the losses that these Russian companies are experiencing by having these pipelines cut short? As we all know, looking geographically, if the West is no longer an option for Russian exports, there's no one to the north, so that leaves us the south and the east. So we'll explore these two directions. The first main direction is to China. China is an absolute economic powerhouse. I don't need to name any stats to convince anyone of that. There is actually a pipeline that has just been completed to China. This is called the Sila Sibiri, the Power of Siberia pipeline, which has directed 38 billion cubic meters of gas to China, and is an additional 10% is under construction from the other direction. So this is coming from central Russia, not quite the north, not quite the enormous reserves that we see in the northern Arctic or the northern Russia in the Arctic Circle. This is coming from central Russia, central Siberia, and going to China. So there is in total 38 billion that is coming from that direction, and another 10 billion that's coming from the far east, the Sakhalin Islands, just north of Japan, that's now coming to China as a pipeline gas from the east of China. So in total, 48 billion cubic meters just completed there. And I'll remind you that Russia was exporting 190 billion cubic meters to Europe. So that's the sort of number we have to reach in order to fully replace the loss of exports to Western Europe with alternatives. So we've now found 48 and lost 190. So we'll continue down the list. There's actually old Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan pipelines. These pipelines were actually built in the Soviet days when Uzbekistan was a net exporter of natural gas to the central Soviet area. However, now Uzbekistan has grown in population, has really grown in its own domestic demand, and it's actually an importer of natural gas as well. So these pipelines have now been activated in the other direction, and natural gas from Russia has been going to Kazakhstan and then on to Uzbekistan. And interestingly enough, China has now connected itself to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, so these pipelines now have a direct route to China through Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan from the Russian heartland. So these projects are for now small, only 4 billion cubic meters have been pumped in 2022, but it is able to scale up to 11 billion. So still not in the same order of magnitude, but sizable, 11 billion cubic meters there. And the other huge project in terms of pipeline gas is Sila Sibiri 2. So we had Sila Sibiri Power of Siberia, which we talked about to China. And then we have Sila Sibiri Power Siberia 2, which is under negotiation and has been under very intense negotiation for the last decade without any major breakthroughs to this day. So this is where we see commentators speak about China really able to exert influence in Russia and is able to really set the tone of negotiations and demand certain prices for gas, cheaper prices than in other directions. We see that that's not necessarily the case because the countries have simply not been able to come to an agreement in this case. So it seems that Russia and China have differing views in terms of what is a fair price for gas. That seems to be the only reason that is holding up this project. However, this project is a potential 50 billion cubic meters of natural gas. And this project is very important for the Russians because it actually connects from the Yamal gas fields in the north. So the gas fields that were previously exporting to Europe. So these gas fields, first and foremost, are enormous. And second of all, this pipeline would stretch the entire Siberian plain from north to south and then from west to east, effectively connecting the two separate Russian gas pipeline infrastructure segments. The Russian gas infrastructure is split into the east and west. This pipeline would connect the two and enable the Russians to balance their gas across their entire country and also to develop this region much more so in a similar way as Ukraine was developed 70 years ago. For now, Siberia to be developed by having this major pipeline coming all the way through it, developing manufacturing and heating and various municipal systems across the Siberian plain. So that's a very important pipeline, Sila Sibiri 2. something to look out for, but something that unfortunately has really been stalling. So we'll see if any announcements come to us from the BRICS summits, but I wouldn't hold my breath. This is something to really look out for as a sort of pointer for Russian-Chinese cooperation and development there.
Yeah, from my understanding, Sibir 2 is basically one of the biggest projects Russia has ongoing at the moment, along with the SMO. It's literally like the top two, probably, priorities, I would say. And of course, the third priority would most likely be how to ease or even reduce the various international sanctions, right? Mostly from the West. I think those three, like the top three to do things on, I would say, the United Russia and the bureaucrats of Russia, their sort of list of what exactly, how to move their country forward is to resolve these particular issues. Now, what's interesting, of course, is you mentioned briefly the potential for an Azerbaijan-Iran pipeline as well. We know the curious thing, Putin continues to visit Aliyev, a very warm relationship with very warm relationships with Azerbaijan have continued. And that's one thing that's really curious because, again, Azerbaijan is a Shia country, Turkey is a Sunni country, but both countries consider themselves sort of descendants of the ancient Turkic people who once originated in Central Asia in the Altai Mountains. And they sort of they can consider themselves of the same ethnos and essentially the same family group, despite being two different branches of Islam. But we do see Russia, of course, gladly selling large amounts of gas to Turkey through those pipelines which run through the Black Sea, and even they touch Europe, and a little bit it goes to Greece, etc. It's like a major investment. So the other question is, would there be any future big pipelines, leading through Azerbaijan into the Middle East potentially, which has its own, energy considerations. The Middle East is a very busy place, and it's almost an entire lecture in and of itself needs to be dedicated to the Middle Eastern energy markets and exports, because that's a major sort of play. And we know there's almost memes created about it, of course, in the early 2000s, but it's mostly, of course, oil, right? But what's curious here is that potential for the Armenian, Azerbaijan, Iran gas relationship to build with Russia. But again, this is even less developed than Sibir 2, so it's very much speculative. And the other, I think, geopolitical weird conspiracy between why Sibir 2 is still under negotiations, one thing, as you said, is price. So China clearly, what are the Chinese interests, right? Is to set a decently low enough price for itself to purchase this gas from Russia continuously, or even how much they would need to invest into the initial pipeline, right? And of course, Russia in consideration would be, well, what kind of a price can we set for a lengthy enough contract for the gas? So like how high can we actually barter it? How high can we actually organize the price to be between China? In Russian interests, as high as the price can be, then that's probably a good consideration, because we know that China will most likely never ask for that gas to stop flowing as soon as Sibir 2 is established. So yeah, it's just very difficult. But yeah, the conspiracy stems across the fact that, well, the Sibir 2 technically would need to go through Mongolia in order to cut corners, and not really in order to save money. The pipeline naturally would need to flow through Mongolia. But we know Mongolia is a very pro-Western country. It has very ancient anti-Chinese sentiments. Like we know shortly after World War I, during the Russian Civil War, there were huge conflicts inside of Mongolia. Anti-Chinese sentiments were quite heavy, even more so than what we see between the Uyghurs and the Chinese at the moment, with all those Islamic tensions. Mongolia, not being a Muslim country, still very strongly anti-Chinese. And that's why we see NATO representatives on occasion travel to Mongolia for various conferences. I mean, this is very much adversarial towards Chinese interests geopolitically. So naturally, China would not want a massive pipeline, which in the future it could potentially depend on, because China is it eats through that energy to flow through a country which is, again, opposed to it. And this may also be one of the reasons why President Putin, as we said, he recently visited Aliyev in Azerbaijan, and he also visited Mongolia. And despite the fact that Mongolia is one of the ICC member countries and Vladimir Putin has a warrant, there's a warrant out for President Vladimir Putin's arrest. Nevertheless, it was so important for him to, for some reason, go to Mongolia for some sort of discussions that he still went regardless, and disrespected the entire Western international community, which I think is a bonus for everyone involved. But one thing I wanted to kind of jump to, now that we spoke very deeply on the actual gas pipelines, the other form of gas transportation you mentioned, the more complex, more, energy rich in terms of it actually takes energy to freeze this gas, is the LNG, right? The LNG style gas, which is used in various countries such as Australia, and even you mentioned Turkey potentially importing this sort of gas. Where does the Russian market lie in terms of LNG, and where exactly does this sit in terms of the Russian economy? Because we understand Russian gas pipelines are super important. Where does LNG fall in this particular equation of Russian gas exports?
Yeah, great question. So LNG is very important to the Russians. It is not quite as big as the pipeline exports that they have because by nature of the Soviet Union really just plopping down these pipelines in all different directions, they were a bit technologically late to the party when it comes to LNG and the whole technology of liquefaction of the gas. However, Russia has really been taking steps over the last 20 years to develop its liquefied natural gas infrastructure. So there's three main projects that are now up and running. So the first one was the Sakhalin LNG. So this is once again near the Japanese islands to the north of Japan. There is the island of Sakhalin, and there is 11.4 billion cubic meters of export capacity. So now we understand how much that is in the global scheme of things. It's quite a sizable project. There is a project at the Yamal fields in the northern Arctic. So these are the super huge fields that Russia is really banking on and trying to export in as many different directions as possible. So the Yamal LNG field is 18 billion cubic meters, which is quite large. And then there is a third project also in the same area, which is called Arctic LNG. And that is currently 13 billion cubic meters capacity, with a third stream being stood up for a total of 20 billion cubic meters once completed. These Arctic projects and Sakhalin as well are very interesting because they're domestic Russian technology that's used there. And it's actually significantly cheaper than, for example, in Qatar, which is the other huge, and Australia, the other huge LNG natural gas exporters, because they actually use the atmosphere to cool the gas significantly and they have less work to do themselves. If it's negative 40 outside, that brings you much closer to negative 166 than if it was plus 40. So the Russians have introduced new technology and it's actually cost saving using the atmosphere to get part of the way there. So in total, these three projects add up to approximately 50 billion cubic meters of gas, so very significant. However, one thing to note is that these projects are 50 cubic meters of gas together. However, it's important to note that this last project, the Arctic LNG, is under extreme United States, very targeted sanctions. We've seen an evolution in the sanctions regime from the United States, where in the beginning they were trying to choke hold the entire oil sector. As you mentioned, that proved to be too much for them. It's quite frankly not possible to do that, and Russian oil continues to go in all directions almost as much as it has pre the SMO. However, in this case, what they've done is they've really been targeted and they've sanctioned absolutely every single thing to do with this Arctic LNG project. So this is a huge project. It's costing an upwards of 15 billion US dollars to set up this field in northern Siberia within the Arctic Circle. The United States have sanctioned everything with it, everything to do with it, including the dredging ships that are used to deepen the port, right, to enable it to be deep enough for large container ships to dock there, sanctioning the technology, the LNG technology, sanctioning any ship that enters the port is immediately targeted by United States sanctions of the highest order. And the owners of the ships are targeted. Any ships that the Russians were trying to purchase, they were from Korean shipyards. They were building special Arctic class LNG carriers for this project. These ships are completely under sanction, and the Korea has actually torn up the contract and not delivered the ships to the Russians, which has been very painful. And despite all of this, the Russians have been able to complete this project, set up the first two lines of production with $13 billion cubic meter capacity. And there has been a total of 5 ships. So this is a developing story. There's only been 5 ships that have docked and onboarded liquefied natural gas, and are now, as we speak, sailing across the globe towards Southeast Asia, and no one knows where these ships are going. it's it's actually a very interesting story because these ships, what they tried to do is spoof their location. So they went into the Arctic Circle and they spoofed their location, which means to all of the satellites that they made it seem via their transponders that the ships were just doing circles in the Arctic Ocean, whereas in reality they were going into the Arctic LNG terminal and being onboarded with large amounts of liquefied natural gas, very expensive. The Western press, the Western security services released images of these ships actually docking to the Arctic LNG. So these ships are under heavy sanctions. Basically, the owners of these ships cannot have anything to do with the United States. No United States company can have anything to do with the owners of these ships. And what they're trying to resort to now is actually even do ship transfers, which is quite common in the oil sector, but it's completely unheard of in the liquefied natural gas sector. So what they do is under the cover of clouds, two ships meet each other and then they transfer the natural gas from one ship to another ship, which is a very difficult thing to do because you have to maintain the temperature of negative 166 degrees. This is something that, quite frankly, does not happen. This is not accepted practice. Once again, it is in the oil field, in the oil industry, where it's much easier. It's just a liquid to just transfer across. But in the liquefied natural gas, it's completely unheard of. But that's what these owners of these ships are resorting to, have to do to try and avoid these sanctions. And then the United States is trying to play whack-a-mole with these tankers, trying to figure out which tanker is going where. There's obviously much fewer of them than there was in the Russian oil industry. There's only a small handful of tankers that can dock in this one location. And it's obvious where the gas is coming from when a tanker docks at this location. And the jury's still out what's going to happen with this situation. And the oil tankers, the liquefied natural gas tankers themselves are bought secondhand through proxy companies within India and the United Arab Emirates. So there's about 4 layers or 5 layers or more of proxy companies and proxy ownership, and they buy secondhand ships that are about to be written off, and then they try and avoid sanctions through that. But then the only question, the most important question that remains is who will take this cargo, and will anyone take this cargo? And that's an interesting one. Watch out for our Twitter spaces. I'm opening up a Twitter, Gennady _G_G. We'll keep you informed as to this unraveling situation. Very, very interesting situation that's currently unfolding. A possible resolution within the next couple of weeks.
That's an epic story, Gennady. You know, one really interesting thing is like it seems like because of all the sanctions, like they're sanctioning everything, as you mentioned, from the dredging ships that actually make the harbor usable to even like shovels, any equipment that went into actually producing the gas itself and exploiting it. And despite the fact that this technology, learning about it, developing it further, could actually assist the entire world. Right, it's not just Russia that it will enrich. Russia, as you mentioned, doesn't export that much LNG. It's new to the market, but the US is so keen on geopolitically stifling its opponent, so politically interested in putting down the so-called regime of Vladimir Putin that it's willing to put the entire industry essentially at risk, right? Essentially, reducing global competition. And Russians are on average very, very smart people. Russia has developed amazing technology over the last 200, 300 years, has contributed vastly to the fields of sciences. There's major scientists and inventors we can name. And in fact, with Russian personnel actually developing further and investigating LNG, how it can be transported, stored, etc., they're stifling that entire market. So essentially, it will hurt not just potentially even the United States. May be like a double-edged sword, right? Striking at this particular field, which Russia is still kind of exploring and still getting used to, including, as you mentioned, ship-to-ship LNG transportation. Maybe that can be perfected in some way, but alas, we're having to do it under the cover of some sort of hiding from spy satellites of the West. Makes it very difficult. And yeah, it's just incredibly concerning how, as we see, Nord Stream 1 and 2 examples are great. Like the Western globalists, the elites are so interested in targeting Russia and doing whatever they can in order to defeat their opponent that the actual citizens of Western countries in the long term are suffering because of that. So the interests, they're essentially saying in the long term, it'll be worth it because liberal democracy will reign supreme and capitalism will win over in this new Cold War. But yeah, I'm not sure. We really haven't seen the world become a better place since the end of the Cold War. If anything, things have become worse culturally speaking. But this is quite interesting. And we do see how the level of animosity the West really has, despite all the kind words that some, maybe pro-Russian spokespersons really put out. We do know that the military-industrial complex of the West, and in the West particularly led by the United States, and their sort of Zionist allies, the particular animosity they have towards Russia is so well developed and so deeply ingrained that they know exactly which industries to target, pinpoint, sniper level precision, and they go at it to the point where even this cargo, right? This cargo is essentially like the black market, is poisonous. If any country officially takes all this gas, which is very helpful and useful, and it could enrich these local industries in Southeast Asia, for example, wherever these ships dock eventually. And naturally, the West is not interested in assisting, the people who live, say, below a certain standard in Southeast Asia, and giving them this very valuable product, despite, and they're sort of marking it as essentially claiming the Russians are on some level equivalent to pirates, which is a bit crazy, I think, in my understanding. But kind of pivoting towards how, gas and oil, it's very much related to this particular country, which historically has been a rival and an opponent of Russia very much. These two countries have developed side by side. Well, at one point, Russia has always had the territorial superiority over its neighbor, which its neighbor is, of course, Germany, right? And then Germany had always had the technological, I would say, always had the technological upper hand until very recently, until the end of the Second World War, and of course the Marshall Plan and the division of Germany. And Germany still has not released itself and loosened itself after the occupation of the United States, and even after the Eastern Bloc fell, the entirety of Germany essentially fell under essentially foreign occupation by NATO and the United States. So maybe we can say a few words about this major player in the European economy and how exactly gas, electricity, oil contribute to what we can today call essentially the unfortunately failing German economy and the German state, because the German people are some of the smartest, it's one of the most populated European country, but unfortunately at the moment they are under this American yoke, you can say, or the yoke of NATO, and they don't have much independence. And we can see with the Nord Stream 1 and 2 projects going under, things are getting very, very bad for them. And the German chancellor, he's not really representing the German people in any capacity, as we can see with his open pro-Ukrainian, pro-Zelensky statements. So maybe we can touch on Germany a bit before we move on to the other major energy resource, which is oil. And of course, that's super crucial because Russia and oil, these two things kind of go hand in hand in the 21st century. Again, similar to gas, but something we really need to touch on in detail.
Yeah, look, the Russo-German relationship has been vital importance and has really led to this prosperity of both Eastern and Western Europe over the past decades, especially after the fall of the Soviet. So if we just take it back to the figures, Russia exported about 190 billion cubic meters to the West. About 100 to 120 of that was to Germany. So an absolute enormous amount of exports. So that has since gone to effectively zero, and Russia has tried to replace it with LNG and pipelines to the east. But we can say that the United States has very much succeeded in managing to sever the ties between Russia and Germany, with significant pain to both the Russian and German economies. There was a paper actually released by the European Commission, or commissioned by the European Commission, that has just recently come out and stated that their electricity prices are 2 to 3 times higher than Americans. So they're actually not as competitive as the Americans are by nature of all of the goods that they produce, having this base input cost that is 2 or 3 times higher than it is for American companies. The relationship between Russia and Germany is one that's really been flourishing, or that really was flourishing up to the 2021 election of Scholz. The previous chancellor of Germany, actually, Gerhard Schroeder, was appointed to the board of directors of Gazprom after he left office of the German chancellor, just going to show how close the ties were, to be honest. And Germany was able to enjoy real economic prosperity, to be the manufacturing base of Europe and the whole world for decades, based on cheap Russian natural gas. The price of natural gas in Germany has only doubled in the last couple of years. And I say only doubled because their consumption has actually gone down by 20%. So Germany is consuming 20% less natural gas than what it was 2 years ago. And we can see that despite the price has still doubled. The 20% reduction is absolutely huge. It's catastrophic for a developed economy. About 10% of that was for individuals in homes for heating and electricity purposes, and about 10% of that was in the manufacturing base of the German economy. We can see that the biggest industries hit in Germany were things that are really that consume a large amount of energy, things like manufacturing, things like paper mills, steel smelters, pharmaceuticals, fertilizer production, and ship and car manufacturing, and things of that nature. We've actually seen what I believe is the last paper mill. I think there was 4 or 5 major paper mills that existed in Germany. They will all close by the end of 2024. German steel is no longer competitive with anywhere else in the world, and it has to be heavily subsidized by the government. Fertilizer production and fertilizer use. For those who don't know, ammonia fertilizer is the most common type of fertilizer. It actually uses gas. It actually uses gas as an input, not only for energy, but it actually needs altered gas, natural gas, to produce the fertilizer. So that has gone up in production and increased then the cost of all agricultural products produced in Germany. It's absolutely incredible, quite frankly. It's unbelievable what the German chancellor has chosen to do, because They've cut off their nuclear energy over the last decade. They've weaned themselves off of coal because apparently that's dirty. And then they've now declined to do any business with their monopolistic gas supply. It's incredible. And they're now forced to buy liquefied natural gas, which of course comes in short-term contracts. The gas pipelines, when you put a pipeline, you have a contract for about 30 years. And it's usually tied to the price of oil with some sort of multipliers and various other inputs into that equation. However, for liquefied natural gas, every single ship you have to bid for. So there is 50 ships that are floating in the ocean. You bid for the ship, and you want for that particular ship to come to your gas terminal, broadly speaking. So every day you have to continue to bid, and any sort of calamity or any sort of increase in demand on the other side of the globe will then increase your price as well, because you have to bid against essentially the whole globe when it comes to liquefied natural gas. We've really seen Germany shoot itself in the foot economically when it comes to all of its energy resources, which is, of course, the foundation for any economy, let alone a manufacturing powerhouse as is Germany. So this is very much a developing story. We've just seen Volkswagen post its first loss, either in its history or in its 30 years. We've seen multiple shipbuilders close down and all have to be bought out by the government, which they're saying is only for a short period of time, and they'll privatize them again in 3 to 5 years. This is very much a developing story, and we'll see this continue to develop in the German unemployment rate, in the German inflation rate, and in German election results over the next year as things come to fruition. But it's a very interesting development that I suggest everyone keep an eye on, is the German economy and the German politics. So the AfD, of course, the Alternative for Germany, the up and coming political party in that space. But that is where I can see that some real developments take place, some potentially a new course for Europe. I can see that happening in Germany over the next sort of 3 to 5 years as that develops. But Germany has, without a doubt, taken a massive blow. It's actually fallen underneath Russia in terms of economy size by purchasing power parity as per the World Bank 2024 numbers. Russia is now the fourth largest economy. And I think Germany is the sixth behind Japan. I believe, I believe that's the case. So someone can correct me on those numbers, but Russia definitely has overcome Germany by purchasing power parity by the World Bank's numbers. So we'll see what the Germans have to say about this in their democratic institutions over the next 3 to 5 years.
That's very fascinating. One thing, Gennady, that I'd want to kind of pivot towards is that it appears that Germany, of course, depending on LNG, and even I heard that Germany is even importing electricity directly from France because France is still producing the majority of French electricity. Actually, it comes from nuclear reactors. Yeah, nuclear reactors, right? Which this is why that Niger crisis that took place in the Sahel recently with the, Burkina Faso, Mali supported coup that occurred in Niger, which was a major uranium exporter to France, was such a big deal because France, unlike Germany, has 40 plus, I believe, nuclear reactors. But we won't be touching on France too much just at the moment, but just pivoting over to oil, right? We mentioned Russia's main competition in terms of gas. In the world, really gas, it's not really a market which is competitive, I suppose, because every region kind of supplies gas to its neighbors via the pipelines, right? LNG probably is a different story, given that you can be transported by ships. But with oil, it's quite competitive. And in fact, competition, market manipulation, it's almost like in shares and stocks and cryptocurrency in a way. Massive oil producing countries can actually impact the global economic markets drastically. It's almost a different beast, right, when compared to the gas macroeconomic market, I think, in the world. The best example of, say, a major crisis in oil was during the Cold War, the 1973 oil crisis, which was between OPEC, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. And this was related to, of course, Israel's Yom Kippur War, when Israel went to war against Palestinians, Syria, and Egypt at the same time. And of course, all these Sunni Muslim countries essentially enacted an oil embargo against Israel and against many countries, actually, who supported Israel. And this caused essentially an economic crisis in the 1970s, which was quite major. But this is something we're not frankly seeing today, given the various interesting things taking place and unfortunate things, such as the genocide of the Palestinians taking place in the Middle East, and which has been also happening, by the way, in Syria as well. We did not see any such reaction as in 1970s, which kind of shows as to who the leaders are in the Hijaz, in the Arab Peninsula countries, right? Exactly where their interests lie, with money or with their compatriots who fall into the Sunni slash maybe even Salafi related Muslim family, right, of the Middle East. So it's interesting who speaks money or faith and religion in this particular context. In the 1970s, it seems that religion and brotherhood between these Middle Eastern peoples came first. But what's curious here, you mentioned oil. Saudi Arabia, one of the major producers, Russia, a key producer of oil. The other one I can naturally think of is when we think about the Rockefellers, all the major oligarchs of the United States, American history, 19th century history. You think of the major the oil fields of Texas and all these other southern states. I mean, the United States, the Gulf of Mexico, or major oil producer, right? It's a world superpower similar to Russia. And oil was one probably even a larger. Naturally, you can correct me, Gennady, but I think oil is even a much larger and more important element than gas is in sort of world affairs, because it appears to people joke to this day that essentially the Iraq war was essentially caused specifically in order to gain control over some of those Mesopotamian, essential Middle Eastern oil fields and the Persian Gulf and some of those key exporting facilities that Saddam was potentially going to encroach upon, right? So, just very interestingly, maybe we can get into oil specifically and how Russia plays a role here, and what is Russia's relationship with OPEC and Saudi Arabia? Because we know Saudi Arabia has recently become a BRICS member state, and it's soon to be ratified, I believe. And that's quite promising because if Russia and Saudi Arabia can normalize their relations, sort of looking past the American petrodollar, right, which is also surprise attached to oil, then perhaps the world could see some stability in oil prices and as well as maybe even economic world trade as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll hop over to the oil sector. We'll spend less time on this one because it's less pertinent to sort of Russian geopolitical ambitions and the Russian economy, quite frankly, a little bit. But it is the god market when it comes to the energy space. So oil has been slightly reducing over the last couple of decades, but it really remains as the biggest player in the energy space. It's not used so much in electricity generation this day as it was previously. That's now been replaced by other means like nuclear and gas and hydro and renewables, but it is very much used for transportation, with the overwhelming majority of the vehicles around the globe being internal combustion engine vehicles and requiring petrol in most cases or diesel to move around. So it's really the lifeblood of the world economy to this day. In terms of the Russian government and the Russian oil sphere, it's very similar to the gas sphere, where the companies, it's a mix of public and private companies, some mixed, some entirely private, as we discussed in the gas segments of the economy. It is very heavily covered with taxation by the Russian government. And oil and gas revenues cumulatively make up about half of the Russian government budget. That's when people say that Russia is a petrol state, really dependent on its natural resources. That's what they're talking about. That a large part of the Russian state budget, not total economy, but government budget, is made up with oil and gas revenues. And if you were to ask me my opinion on that, I think that's great. I think a lot of that is due to their ownership in these companies. And the other reason is, quite frankly, high taxation for the resources that belong to the Russian people are rightfully taxed when they're taken out from the earth and exported or burnt or in other ways used up, with irreversibly so. For oil, Russia has, unlike in the gas sector, not been heavily hit by sanctions. We've seen that the Russian oil production is only down by about 5% since the start of the SMO. And there was a period of time where the Russian oil brands, there was a period of time where the Russian oil mark Urals was trading at a significant discount to Brent and other benchmarks of $60, which was the price ceiling implemented by the Western nations. However, this has since, quite frankly, collapsed, and the Russian oil is trading at its own price above the $60 threshold and has done so for the last year or so. The biggest markets that Russia has now been sending its oil is now India and China. Basically, no Russian oil is going to the West. These exports are done via ships in most cases. So the oil market is more skewed towards ships because it's much easier to do. So you can have a 50-year-old oil tanker, and it's not as much as a secure of a hazard as a LNG gas carrier, which obviously has to maintain electricity, maintain all its sort of capabilities, as opposed to an oil tanker, which just needs to be sealed. Broadly speaking, much simpler. The Russians are able to export their oil from their terminals At the beginning of the sanctions, we saw a similar situation where Russian oils were being exported out of the Russian ports without any destination ports being designated. And then via ship to ship transfers and via various blends, there was a joke about the Latvian blend, where ships would come out of Russia and that ship would come out of Latvia and that Latvian ship would be basically empty and would take the whole cargo of the Russian ship, and suddenly you got a Latvian oil export ship, which was 1% from Latvia and 99% from Russia, but nonetheless, it was able to be re-exported to any point in the world at that stage. So we saw funny business like that. We saw ships hiding their destination, but now there's none of that. Ships come out of various Russian ports and set their designation to Indian or Chinese ports or Southeast Asian ports without much concern. It's really the West has found, or the United States has found, that it's not possible to sanction such large of a market with hundreds of oil tankers containing Russian oil at any given time across the globe. So the Russian oil is broadly traveling around unhindered at this point, but it's not going to Western ports, or at least anywhere near as much with as much frequency as it was prior to 2022. But the big news story here is the large increase in India, where Russia has now become the biggest oil exporter to India, coming from basically almost no oil exports to India, which has been a really big step forward. And the other important thing to discuss here is the relationship with OPEC, which you rightfully mentioned, is that actually Saudi Arabia has reduced its oil production to the lowest rate that it's had over the past 10 years. And that's actually enabled Russia to slightly increase its oil production and also maintain the global oil prices. So this is either the relationship via BRICS or the bilateral ties between Russia and Saudi Arabia, with possible incentives for Saudi Arabia being friendly in all directions and really having its real estate and really having its internal investment, foreign direct investment coming into Saudi Arabia, by nature of it, continuing to trade and continuing to have bilateral and multilateral ties with the whole globe. This is the sort of concession that they appear to have made towards Russia and towards OPEC, where OPEC has these very strict production constraints all across all of its members, and it acts effectively as a monopolistic provider, a cartel. And all of the oil providers are there, or many of the oil providers are an OPEC or OPEC Plus, and they come together and they basically say, hey, we will not produce as much oil as what we can produce. Why? Because that'll actually flood the market and make the price too cheap. Interestingly enough, they also go the other way where they don't underproduce the oil, because that will make alternatives much more viable. So if they were to do what they tried to do in the 1970s and really restrict the supply of oil, and oil were to hypothetically go to $200 a barrel, it would really make all of the alternatives like green energy, nuclear energy, much more viable, and really in the long term hurt the cartel themselves, this OPEC cartel. So the OPEC cartel has a formal price target of about $80 per barrel of oil, and it actually does not want it to be higher nor lower than that. And we see that broadly being successful, as the price has stayed right around that level. But in order to keep it at that level, they've actually had to reduce the number of oil they produce. And Saudi Arabia has actually taken upon itself the largest amount of that reduction. So very interesting. So we can go very much deeper into that and various ties. You mentioned Iraq and all of the other states that produce oil, and the various possible ties and combinations and configurations, and the interest why Saudi Arabia has done that. But we can just constitute the fact that it has been done, and it's been a positive outcome for the Russian Federation, where it's been able to broadly produce as much oil as it has previously for the same price that it has previously, and not had a second front, an economic second front opened up against it. It's a very interesting action by Saudi Arabia there over the last couple of years.
That's very interesting, Gennady. What you mentioned about how Saudi Arabian Russian relations very promising for the future, and of course, it's really curious, somewhat amusing. India, refusing essentially to buy vast amounts of oil from a majority Muslim countries, given India's relationship with its own Muslim neighbors, frankly, Bangladesh in the east. Like we know the recent Bangladeshi Hindu pogroms that were taking place. Of course, the Hindus are a small minority in Bangladesh, but India being a majority Hindu country really does care for essentially what you have in Bangladesh is an Indian Hindu Donbass, right? Which against the Muslim majority, the Indians seem to have an interest in, and they wanted to sort of defend their cultural autonomy. And of course, you have the Indian Pakistani conflict, which probably goes a long way, and that probably sours the entire Indo-Islamic relationship. So India, of course, wants to be less reliant and less contingent on its these major Islamic countries, which are not really that far away, but still being more dependent on, I want to say, its so-called Indo-European northern neighbors, of course, in Russia, just across the mountains over there. It really does make sense why India is purchasing the majority of its crude oil from the Russian Federation in 2024. Very interesting, despite all the sanctions, mind you. So it does make sense. So, religion, culture, geopolitical interests, civilizational interests, they do kind of play even into the economic money factor. All these things intertwine and interrelate, which is kind of why these particular episodes are so interesting, right? Because we kind of break it down and even connect it to the various other themes which we discuss on our podcast here on World War Now. The two other resources which we earmarked at the beginning of the episode, you mentioned, of course, coal and uranium. Now, we know coal is probably the oldest form of energy resource, gas, oil being somewhat new, uranium being the most, shall we say, sci-fi futuristic form, which perhaps hasn't even been developed. Like we know, of course, of Chernobyl and all the other nuclear major power plants which existed across the USSR, America, France is heavily dependent on nuclear technology. Of course, uranium is used to create not just the energy, but also probably the greatest weapons of our age, right? Nuclear weapons, so-called massive explosive tactical nukes are spoken about quite a bit in the Ukrainian context. Unfortunately, that's what politicians are doing these days. And uranium, just as a sort of source of fuel, is not just very efficient, but also seems to be the cleanest out of the three. Perhaps gas is maybe similar in terms of actual what kind of carbon and the waste that it produces being quite minimized if we are concerned about ecology. I mean, ecology does matter, and polluting like local flora and fauna, it does actually impact the particular regions. You don't want to just turn Siberia into this post-apocalyptic sort of wasteland where just energy is produced, exploited, the land is broken apart, and then that's exported for essentially for money and cash. That seems a bit counterproductive. So nuclear energy, uranium and coal, let's let's touch on these particular 2 points of order because, again, coal seems to be quite. Perhaps you can touch on exactly the importance of coal first, and then we can pivot towards uranium in the Russian context and even what the Russian nuclear industry is like, because we do know Russia is an expert at constructing nuclear reactors, and it's a particular industry which Russia has been working on since essentially, you can say, almost the mid 20th century.
Yes, absolutely, Dmitry. And we'll spend the least amount of time on coal of the four, and then we'll move on to nuclear because we do have a lot of interesting points on the nuclear front, and it's very much an area of development as opposed to coal, which is broadly falling out of favor across the globe. When we talk about coal, we are very much talking about China and Southeast Asia first and foremost as a market. The Western Europe and North American markets for coal are really reducing both in the consumption and in the production of coal, whereas the Southeast Asian and Chinese markets are increasing. Chinese market is still booming. The Chinese really don't care what source of energy they use, as long as it keeps their light bulbs on, so to speak. Their coal consumption is enormous, and their production is absolutely mind-boggling. It's almost as much as the rest of the world combined at this stage, and they continue to introduce new coal mining shafts, at a faster pace than anyone else. When we talk about Russian coal production, we are unfortunately talking about under invested industry, an underinvested industry that since the 90s, since the Soviet Union collapsed, have really not seen the required attention, both from private and public eyes. The two main companies in Russia that produce coal are entirely privately owned. So this is an area where the Russian government officially has the least stake. So Russia has almost zero public coal companies, which is very interesting. However, the two private companies have broadly been able to keep the lights on in many of the towns and villages and municipalities that depend on them for jobs and depend on them for the coal consumption to keep themselves warm in the very cold Russian, Siberian, and Far East winters. So there was a study in 2019 that showed that up to 60% of surface mining equipment was of foreign origin that is used in the coal mining industry in Russia. So these are open mines, crater mines that are really large in size and are on the surface of the earth, and up to 85% of underground mines. The equipment used in underground mines is of foreign origin. So unfortunately, Russia is very much dependent on foreign equipment when it comes to its coal mining industry, and that's a byproduct of the two remaining companies being privately owned. Large companies, but privately owned. It's not a real centralized approach where there is a manufacturing base that builds the equipment, where there is a miner, then there is a refiner, and there is a consumer. No, there is just a miner that is privately owned and it goes to the market and purchases equipment. Since the 90s, unfortunately, the cheapest equipment, the best equipment was from overseas. So we really see that Russia is dependent on foreign equipment when it comes to its coal mines. And unfortunately, the other aspect that makes coal mining difficult in Russia is the limitation of railways. So many of the basins, the coal basins in the Russian Federation, are in central Siberia or in the Far East. And as I mentioned, the markets, the consumption markets are in Southeast Asia and China, so very much in the east. The main port being for Russia, Vladivostok, the Far East ports. So you can imagine that out of all of the competing goods that are traveling across this space, sending enormous amounts of coal is quite expensive. It's quite heavy and it's quite a low cost good relative to the amount of size that it takes up and the amount of congestion that it causes on the Trans-Siberian railway line. Of course, Russia has two railways that go from central Russia to the Far East. That's the Railroad and the Trans-Siberian rail line. So broadly, these two arteries are the only export directions for coal, and it is congested, quite frankly. And there's quite heavy competition between all the other goods that are being exported and imported and transferred in various directions via these two railway lines. And the most interesting thing that I'd like to call out here is that there is a private port being built by these coal mining companies and a private railway line that reaches almost 1,000 kilometers in length that is built through the Russian Far East. And that circumvents and is actually a third addition to these two existing railway lines. And interesting enough, these are entirely privately owned projects. So a whole 1,000 kilometer railway line through mountains, through the ice, through the permafrost, and the private ports simply built for the sole purpose of exporting coal. So I think this is a great step forward for the Russian logistics, not that and the congestion that are existing in the Far East. And I think this is really one of the ways that various other exports will now also be more competitive from Russia to the Far East and to the markets of Southeast Asia and China, with taking up to 50 million tons of coal, which is the capacity of this new railway line, off of the existing railway tracks. So in conclusion, just to summarize the coal market, that Russia is one of the leaders of coal exports, together with Indonesia, Australia being the other two main competitors. And you can see that with their geographic location, all of these competitors are really focused around Southeast Asia being the main import markets, with the main import markets being China, Japan to a lesser extent, Thailand, Vietnam, and various countries in Southeast Asia. So that's that, Dmitry. Nothing too much I want to say more about coal. It's really been stable over the last 30 years. And broadly enough, it's sort of at an acceptable stage for the Russian government, where it does not have to take a major role in this industry. And this industry has maintained the level of production needed for Russian internal consumption and the level of jobs and prosperity for various remote regions within the Russian Federation, with some pluses like this latest railroad development in the Far East, which will then reduce the congestion on the Far East Russian railroads, very much a strategic direction for the Russian Federation. I think that's all I want to say there about coal, and it's broadly evaded many sanctions or direct sanctions, apart from general, re-export of American or German or French mining equipment, which is no longer possible. But that's not too big of a problem with, like I mentioned, China being the biggest producer and therefore also being the biggest producer of the mining equipment needed. So without much of a domestic industry, unfortunately, something that it appears we have lost, there are alternatives. And if anything, it's been more of a loss of the West, where the Russian coal miners are now purchasing Chinese manufactured goods rather than German and American.
Yeah, so it seems that coal, it's one of the oldest forms of industrialized energy resources, which Russia has used in the past. And most countries, most developed countries, have to go through that stage of actually using coal. Their factories, of course, being dependent on China being in one of the major importers of coal still shows that some of its, say, second-rate factories, corporations, and industries still use coal to a large extent. And by second-rate, I mean that coal is just generally cheaper. And so, of course, China does not really care about carbon dioxide, global warming, any of that, which is why it produces so many emissions, right? And yes, that does, we've seen Indian acid storms and things like that, take place, especially on the India-Pakistan border. There are some crazy pollution level smog storms taking place. They're like real, where you cannot go outside. Kids are sent home from school, things like that, and because it actually begins raining, and the rain burns your skin, like it's that bad. So the pollution is a real consideration locally speaking. Besides, going into any sort of neoliberal conspiracies regarding the world becoming warmer and the end of the world and it being some apocalyptic disaster, there is a negative towards massive work being done with coal on the local environment. So, but unfortunately, it appears that the Chinese economy just continues to churn on, and it does make sense why. So now China is in the first world, but when it was a second world country, economically speaking, why it would invest so heavily in that coal industry. But yeah, it's also very curious. Of course, Russia continues the economics, as you well know, Gennady, is a multifaceted project. You need to sell various resources that you do have, and coal, there's no reason why Russia should stop exporting coal if it has it on its native territory, especially if it doesn't need it itself. But as you mentioned, there are still local municipalities and regions which still use coal in various factories and various other industries. So there's no reason why the entire nation of Russia, which has many ethnicities and is so large in size, should switch to one particular form of energy for itself. Right? Speaking, there's no point of limiting yourself in a way similar to what Germany has done, which is literal sabotage of your own nation and its population. Right? That's just insane. But speaking about the other form of energy, right? Uranium, this is the most mysterious. From my personal research, and this is like going back a few years, perhaps it has changed. The major uranium exporting countries are, of course, Kazakhstan, Australia, the Russian Federation, Niger, and I believe, and I cannot name any more beyond that list, but perhaps you can enlighten me. But those four are the major countries. Kazakhstan being, that's one of the main privileges of Kazakhstan, I believe. It's uranium that it had, and as well as the Kazakhstan spaceports and various other like Area 51 type installations that it had during the USSR on its territory. And it's in very key positions. Like Kazakhstan had a lot of very interesting things built there. And it's a very mysterious space because, again, the Kazakhstan language is not very well known by Westerners, and just the land itself is very mysterious and cool. But uranium is one of the points of Kazakh interest, and the Kazakh people have been exporting uranium for quite some time now. And in fact, when the USSR was still whole, Kazakhstan was one of the main places through which the USSR, being this autarkic, self-dependent economy, would of course exploit uranium, would mine it in Kazakhstan, and then use that uranium to burn it and to produce energy in really distant places, far away from Kazakhstan, even places like Ukraine. Today, when we look at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, we'll look at the famous Chernobyl power plant as well, and even the Kursk power plant, which now is in a lot of media because there's a potential that the Ukrainians are planning to stage an assault on it, or they're trying to crash suicide drones into it, causing another nuclear disaster. Who knows what's happening? But that's a bit of a different subject. Let's begin talking about uranium and this very interesting industry, and perhaps we can even move from the resource of uranium itself, Gennady, to the major corporation that exists in Russia. This is a key business company. Many of you perhaps have heard of it in any news resources, but Rosatom really cannot be ignored in this particular discussion because this is a major player in the nuclear/uranium/technology sector in the entire world. It's almost like Amazon, Tesla, one of these major corporations like Microsoft. It's really, there is no real competitor to Rosatom in the world. But let's get into this very interesting energy discourse, Gennady.
Yes, absolutely. You're correct. Rosatom cannot be ignored. Rosatom is the absolute darling of Russian companies, established directly by decree of Vladimir Putin, having absolutely zero private ownership. So this is an entirely a publicly owned company from start to finish, owned by the Russian government, with a single person, no board of directors, but a single person, Alexei Likhachov, being responsible for the success or failure of the company, reporting directly to Vladimir Putin. This company has done wonders over the past couple of decades since its establishment. Rosatom is not only a nuclear company, but it's actually has very wide scope. It does everything from supercomputers to superconducting materials to, one second, let me just pause. Rosatom has a very wide-ranging set of responsibilities and areas that it excels in, everything from composite materials to nuclear reactors, uranium mining, refining, enrichment, supercomputers, superconductors, Shipbuilding, believe it or not, it's absolutely an incredible technology company that exists in the Russian Federation, as I mentioned, entirely publicly owned. It's the biggest exporter by far of nuclear reactors. So Russia, with its energy demand being relatively constant, relatively in brackets, because in the last year it's increased by about 10%, which is enormous for a developed country. 10% increase in energy consumption is fantastic news, and largely driven by more manufacturing and internal tourism in Russia, but we'll set that aside. Russian internal energy has broadly been stable over the last couple of decades. So Rosatom has turned its energies to the international sphere, and it is far and away the largest exporter of nuclear reactors. It's the second largest builder of nuclear reactors after China, but almost all of Chinese projects are within China. So Chinese are building nuclear reactors for themselves. Russia is building nuclear reactors for the world, with current projects being developed in Bangladesh, Iran, China, Egypt, Hungary, India, Turkey, and now Uzbekistan, adding that to the list. Very great success. And potential in Kazakhstan, with the Kazakhs just recently on the eve of our recording today, declaring that Kazakhstan is for nuclear energy via referendum, and Kazakhstan is now exploring who will build the nuclear reactor in Kazakhstan, with a short list of 4 companies: a Chinese, a Korean, a Russian, and a French company being shortlisted for the potential contract. My personal bet would be a combination of Chinese and Russian, but we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with the outcomes of that there. But back to Rosatom, there's actually over 35 nuclear reactors under construction internationally by this single company. It's absolutely incredible. 27 billion US dollars in revenue in 2023, and it has a whole number of world firsts. It has the world's largest nuclear icebreaker fleet, the only nuclear icebreaker fleet. I don't think any other country operates a single nuclear icebreaker, whereas Rosatom operates 10. It actually operates the Northern Sea routes, which we hear a lot about. So the potential shorter route between China and Europe is actually operated by Rosatom due to the fact that they control the nuclear icebreakers. So they schedule them to keep these lanes open for also the LNG terminals that we talked about previously in the previous segments in the far north. So these areas are maintained by the Rosatom's icebreakers. Furthermore, things for the Russian plane building industry, where they need composite materials that are super strong and extremely light. That is all done by Rosatom, who have an extremely deep technological base and have very large investments in the technology sphere. Interestingly enough, they actually operate schools. So like in many other countries, you can go to a selective school. You can go to a Rosatom school if your child makes the cuts in Russia. They'll take them through all the way from primary to higher education and beyond. To become a world-leading specialist in the nuclear sphere or many other spheres. That's one of the benefits of being so deeply integrated into the Russian government and the Russian political sphere there, that Rosatom is able to really be the cream of the crop when it comes to Russian government companies, and has a global leading position when it comes to the nuclear sphere. So when we talk about nuclear, we broadly talk about uranium mining, then we talk about uranium refining, and then we talk about uranium enrichment. So you're right, those 4 countries that you mentioned are broadly the main miners of uranium. Uranium refining is not too complex of a task, relatively speaking. That's when broadly this very rough ore, which contains dirt and things like that, is refined to what we call yellow cake, a more dense and at this point somewhat dangerous element, because it does emit radioactivity. And then, but finally, however, the most technologically advanced step is actually uranium enrichment. And this is where from the yellow cake uranium ore, the company makes what is then used as fuel for nuclear reactors. So this is an extremely difficult task. It's a task that is different depending on which nuclear reactor you're using, just like the difference between diesel and petrol and gas for your car to some extent. Different nuclear fuels are enriched to different levels and have to be slightly different in product to fit various reactors. So Russian, Chinese reactors, Westinghouse, American reactors, French reactors, and things like that all use slightly different enriched uranium as fuel then for themselves. So the interesting thing is that Rosatom has over 50% of the global uranium enrichment capacity. So it is absolutely a monopolistic player, and is actually one of the reasons of concern for the United States and the West as a whole, and a reason why there's been no sanctions placed on the Russian uranium and nuclear industries, because there simply is no alternative for Russian enrichment of products many French reactors actually use Russian enriched uranium, and some American reactors also use Russian enriched uranium. A little bit of backstory to that is because when in the post-Soviet collapse, Russia had a very large amount of nuclear weapons, and the United States actually made a deal with it where the Russians would disarm their nuclear weapons, and then the uranium, enriched uranium, would be transferred into fuel for Western reactors, which the Russians accepted. And Rosatom was actually able to stay alive by this large amount of work provided to it by turning this weapons grade uranium to electricity grade uranium. And what this actually caused was, due to this just such vastness of the nuclear weapon stocks, there was no need for any sort of enrichment to happen in the West for a decade. And that actually led to them to shut down many of their privately owned enrichment companies and lose the highly qualified specialists and lose the capabilities in this sector. And we end up with Russia now holding a majority monopoly in this space, something that is quite significant on the global scene, because uranium does constitute about 15 or so percent of the energy production across the globe, and much more for some countries, developed countries like France, South Korea, and United States, to name a few there.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you very much, Gennady, for taking the time to give us a real detailed deep dive without any sort of filtered information, no censorship whatsoever on gas, oil, coal, and uranium, and essentially enriched uranium, which Russia is a leader in. Today on this very special episode of the Aether Hour, we really appreciate it because, frankly, it's difficult to have someone who knows all four of the industries and economics in general and how that interrelates with foreign policy and how all these things interconnect, and to make it relevant and, again, to kind of provide it to the listeners in a very interesting fashion that is somewhat in a common tongue, a jargon which we can all kind of understand, because myself not being an expert in economics in any capacity, just even to have some of my questions answered, we really appreciate you coming on the show today. And hopefully in the future, we'll have even more discussions. I know behind the scenes, we've talked about very interesting subject matter, socioeconomic factors, for example, speaking about Russia's demographics, going into the real nitty gritty details of that. Perhaps one day we'll touch on the Middle East, its particular energy sector, all the oil politics that occur there, kind of have a deep dive episode on that in particular. But the Russian various infrastructure manufacturing industries, which are currently developing or have been improving since the 1990s, there's definitely a lot to talk about. And this isn't just dry economic material. This is the stuff which actually provides the Russian population with the financing and with the stability financially and socially speaking to rebuild this once great Christian country, which now it's becoming once again. So again, this is very promising stuff, and it's good to see that these various industries are still developing despite these very selective sanctions. It's shocking that Rosatom is not sanctioned despite the fact that LNG is so pressured. It really shows the hypocrisy and just the devilish type of approach that some of these globalist deep state United States controlled nations, what kind of attitudes they have. They firstly think about themselves and only later think about the various people whom they're harming. But this has been a very deep and enriching episode, no pun intended. So we appreciate you coming on the show today.
I want to go a bit more into detail. I have a few more points on the nuclear stuff. We can really see Rosatom's just how far Rosatom has advanced beyond some of the competitors that exist in the West. If we compare two of the sort of premier projects, one of the French atomic industry, which of course operates many, as you mentioned, Dimitri, a very large amount of nuclear reactors within France. Up to 60% of France's energy comes from nuclear reactors. But these nuclear reactors were all constructed in the period of roughly between the 60s and the 80s of the last millennium. And since then, they've really taken more of like a maintenance approach towards nuclear reactors. Their one single and only project outside of France is in England, actually, at the moment. This project has really been suffering from immense blowouts of budget and immense blowouts of cost. So I really want to compare this project to Russia's premier project in Turkey. So Russia in Turkey, Rosatom in Turkey, is actually building the world's first builder, owner, operator nuclear power plant. So despite this nuclear power plant being in Turkey, it is actually entirely owned by Rosatom. Turkey has zero ownership over this nuclear power plant that is built on its own territory. Now, this is a world first. Usually countries demand that nuclear, or expect, or traditionally the convention has been, that nuclear power plants built in a certain country are operated by that country's nuclear industry, whether public or private. But this is the first case where in Turkey, this enormous, much larger than a standard nuclear reactor installation is owned and operated by Rosatom. So the French in England and the Russians in Turkey have started building at the same time. In 2017, they started building these nuclear reactors. These nuclear power plants actually built up of multiple reactors. The capacity for the French one is 3,200 megawatts. The capacity for the Russian one in Turkey is 4,500 megawatts. So we see roughly a 50% larger capacity of the Russian nuclear reactor in Turkey. Despite this, the cost expected for the French nuclear reactor is 45 billion pounds, because it's in Great Britain, it is in pounds, whereas the Russian nuclear reactor in Turkey is $25 billion. So that's less than half price for this nuclear reactor that is more than 50% higher in capacity. In terms of the completion dates, the French have blown out the completion dates with it coming online no earlier than 2030, whereas the Russians are expecting to come online starting from next year and with the full completion of the site by the year after 2026. So we can see that the Russians are able to deliver a project, 40% faster, a project 50% larger, and 50% less cost. So when we talk about the Rosatom as a player on the global nuclear energy market, we can see that just why it's able to provide such values for these countries like Bangladesh, Iran, China, Egypt, Hungary, India, Turkey, Uzbekistan. And there simply is no other players that can come close aside from the Chinese and maybe the Koreans, but who really don't have as much experience building in various job sites, construction sites around the world and really experience outside of their own countries at this stage. The other interesting aspect is the innovation that Russia has in this space. It really is second to none, Dmitry. It's very, very interesting. So the biggest innovation, the talk of the industry at the moment, is what's called small nuclear reactors. And these nuclear reactors that are about, officially this term is for nuclear reactors under 400 megawatts of power, whereas a normal nuclear reactor is about 1,000 megawatts of power. And then there's multiple nuclear reactors that go into a nuclear power plant. So a nuclear power plant traditionally will have 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts of power generation capacity, whereas a small nuclear reactor is up 1 to 2 to 300. So it's an order of magnitude less than a traditional nuclear reactor. So these small nuclear reactors they really open up a whole new domain, a whole new market across the globe. First and foremost in the Russian Far East. So there is already contracts. And the first small nuclear reactor was actually put on a boat. It was called the Akademik Lomonosov, and it was put on the Far East and continues to sit there to this day and provide nuclear power, clean energy, and able to provide warmth to remote regions of the Russian Far East, Siberia. So this was sort of the test that was done a decade ago. It was put into action. And since then, they've perfected this technology, they've developed this technology, and they actually have further contracts for the Russian Sakhalin Islands, which we heard about, very remote islands in the Far East and various other parts of Chukotka and Russian Siberia and the Far East, to develop and place these small nuclear reactors, which they're actually now building a manufacturing base for, a manufacturing facility to be able to pump these out in mass. This is a really big new development for the world, quite frankly, because these have other uses, whether in remote parts of Southeast Asia, remote parts of China or of India or Central Asia, places where it's just not feasible to put a huge nuclear power plant to be able to maintain it, to be able to protect it. And it has no pipelines and it has no other means of bringing energy to populations in remote areas. You can imagine places where you have to drive oil tankers as the only source of energy to remote locations. You can now put a small nuclear reactor and have it service the nearest 10 villages or towns of various sizes. So this is a very large development, and Russia is on the leading edge of this technology. There are over 50 designs that are currently being worked on across the globe. However, Russia is the only design that's been fully approved by the International Atomic Agency and is the only design that is mass produced now within Russia and has had the first export contract now signed with Uzbekistan, which is an enormous deal to say the least, because it actually will be manned by Uzbeks, which is fantastic news, because the Russian Nuclear Institute has built its first foreign office in Uzbekistan. And now, as we speak, or actually for the past 5 years, it has existed, and local Uzbeks are learning in Russian, in the Russian language, in their home of Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, are studying Russian nuclear fission, and will soon be working and building together with the Russians nuclear reactors on their home soil. So we can imagine the long-term geopolitical effects that this will have, the ties with the region, one country over from Kazakhstan. So really getting deep into the Asian continent and the Asian cultural area. So this is a very, very good news for Russian language in the area, which continues to flourish, and is really good news for the ties between Russia and Uzbekistan. And is one example where the Rosatom is really used for long-term geopolitical, geostrategic goals to develop ties with certain countries. And we can see how Russia is second to none as we've gone through all of these various types of energy today, that Russia is really able to provide the full spectrum of support, very vertically integrated and also horizontally integrated support to various countries. Countries like Iran, countries like Bangladesh, various BRICS nations. As BRICS expands, Russia is able to provide them with their baseload electricity and power and warmth generation that will enable their populations to flourish. And this is why we see that countries in general outside of the golden billion, outside of the Western nations, aren't really interested in joining the sanctions on Russia, because Russia is able to just provide so much, and Russia has fostered so much good faith in so many countries around the globe that what many in the West see as black and white is really seen almost in the other direction as white and black by many other countries of the 7 out of the 8 billion other inhabitants across the globe. And I think Rosatom is really the pinnacle of Russian technology, and will see continue to develop. And I'd love to spend maybe a whole other episode, depending on if our viewers found this interesting, talking about some of the technologies, the reactors of the 4th generation, 4+ generation, fast neutrino reactors, lead-cooled reactors, things that Russians are on the pinnacle of technology of and provide significant benefits in electricity generation, but things which we unfortunately do not have time to talk about today, Dmitry. But I hope that was a nice summary, a brief summary of the Russian nuclear sphere, and in particular, just how dominant it is in terms of global exports, and just how much benefit it is able to bring to Russia and will continue to bring in terms of geopolitical, geostrategic ties over the coming decades.
Thank you very much for all your input, Gennady. It's been an amazing episode. Of course, all of our listeners are greatly enriched, no pun intended, and there'll be more episodes coming out regarding Russia's economics, sociology, all kind of complex matters, which we'll cover with Gennady on the Aether Hour in the future coming up. And possibly Conrad will be joining us as well for some of these future episodes. So stay tuned, everyone. And this episode, of course, no paywall. It's coming out completely free, so everyone can give it a lengthy listen. And we'll definitely be making references to it as we progress through our future World War Now episodes. So thank you, everyone, for listening until the end. Of course, you're wonderful supporters. If you'd like to support the show and support some of the guests we have here, as well as ourselves, the hosts, definitely subscribe to the Substack. You'll definitely receive your value's worth. All the Aether Hour episodes, hours and hours of them, as well as wonderful articles and some future books we'll be publishing. All the various chapters will be available on the World War Now Substack. So that's worldwarnow.co. And of course, Gennady, where can our wonderful audience and listeners find you? Because I believe you do have a Twitter X account. So where can we follow you and some of your insights on economics, Russian history, Russian political insights, as well as just your geopolitical knowledge, which I think you will gladly share with us?
Thanks, Dmitry. It's been an absolute pleasure. Yes, I have started up a Twitter X account. You can find me on @Gennady, N_G_G. So it's Gennady_G_G. I'm absolutely nowhere else apart from there, and on future episodes of World War Now. God giving. Thank you very much for the platform. And it's been an absolute pleasure, Dmitry, to speak with you today. Thank you.
No, God bless, Gennady. Thank you for joining me, my brother. And definitely, we'll have the link below as well. So definitely give Gennady a follow, and more episodes coming out very soon. Thank you. It's been a wonderful 2024, guys.